What else is new with her?
She's always been like that.
All right, let me start resizing some video. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm not sure if we're getting a Gremlo tonight. I caught a bit of stream earlier, but we will see if he winds up hopping in. So now I need to just get my video, and then we'll be good, I think. So give me just a moment.
You're fine. I might have to step away from the computer for like 2 seconds, and then I'll be right back.
Go for it.
Is Professor Iwasaki the awesome vaccine?
She is.
Oh
She's
my
fantastic.
gosh, I've read one of her paper. Her papers are amazing. She had a really good review too out recently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everything Akiko Iwasaki does is gold, pretty much.
Yeah.
They just need to give her like every single dollar and hope for the best.
Dude, that's awesome. That's awesome. They actually had her like testifying like in Congress. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fact that they had like a vaccine summit in and of itself is like
what's up, Grandma?
something. Oh shit! There we go. There's a Gremlo. Hi, Gremlo.
Bro, everyone got haircuts.
Wait, hang on. Did Grem get a haircut?
It looks like it. I don't know.
Like maybe 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, since the last time you saw
Yeah,
Grem, maybe.
Yeah.
I wasn't here.
All right, let me do some resizing then. Give me a moment. Oh, all right. How you doing today, Grandma?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm pretty good. A little dehydrated, I think.
And do be summer.
It do be summer. Oh my god, 100% humidity and like in the upper 90s is garbage.
Ew.
Water's overrated.
That's homophobic right there.
The heat or water being overrated?
Oh, a little bit of both. That's just a preview, by the way, a chat of how unhinged I'm going to be this afternoon or this evening. I'll be right back. I'm going to grab this.
Okay.
Only cis het people have the luxury of not drinking water.
That's right.
Yeah, no, Dr. Neuro has had... he and I have been DMing about some of the COVID Twitter crazies because they're going like insane with monkeypox. So the amount of unhinged is actually going to be pretty high, in a good way.
I'm surprised not a lot of it has come across my timeline.
Oh, you follow the wrong people on Twitter. I can
Probably.
give you the accounts
Or the
and
right.
a couple of screenshots
or
if
the
you
right
want.
people.
Yeah,
The usual suspects show up, right? Like we got your Marjorie Taylor Greens, we got like some of your people who are on a certain website. But
oh, we're talking like people with degrees.
oh no.
Oh yeah, it's bad. Today's discourse was you have to pour bleach into the toilet after you pee to kill the monkeypox virus, which was just insane.
I'm sorry, what?
Yep, an MD said that.
Put the bleach up your pee hole.
I mean, that's probably the next logical step at the rate she's going.
Dude, I've been injecting my bleach right into my lungs this entire time. I'm all out of bleach.
No
God.
need to titrate anything in your IV. We just go straight for the bleach. Pour that shit in. I'm losing my medical license and everything. It's okay. It's worth it, though.
This is recorded.
It's okay. We can delete any of the audio after the fact if you really need us to.
Just put a big black like redacted over the screen as the audio goes muted.
That'd be
Yeah.
awesome.
That was a joke, by the way, but American Medical Association, please don't dox me.
Yeah, I don't think any of them are going to be lurking in the recesses of Twitch. So I think we're safe.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no, Anthony
true.
Fauci's a tier 3 subscriber on my channel. I don't know what you guys are talking about.
I wouldn't wish
Okay,
that
not
fate on
good.
me.
All right.
Well, I mean, a good joke, but just the name and
Right.
it makes me vomit. It's just a reflex. All right, here, let me try resizing some video just to make it a little bit bigger. And I'll probably just play around with the video while we go ahead and get started. All right, I think we're all set. We can just jump right in. So this is 28 or 29? 28? All right. So this is
Go back
Ministry
to
of
the
Science
bottom.
28. Yeah, counting's really hard. I know Greg and I were trying to do that with some of the archived episodes that Greg had on his YouTube, and it wasn't like a complete list. And that's actually kind of a shame because I think the second or third episode, Dr. Neuro was actually on here. So it's been, I don't know, a couple of months at least since you've been here last. So we have a
Hmm.
lot more new eyes who don't know you and what you're about. So that's what's going to make this, I think, a lot more fun once people trickle in. So
Cool.
maybe just go ahead and give everybody a brief primer on like what it is you do, man.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Neuro. I am, well, first off, I do stream on Twitch, but I'm primarily a medical science communicator on Twitter and a couple of other platforms. But in terms of my day job, so I do work for the CDC and a local health system around where I'm at, focusing on infectious disease, control and pandemic preparedness and global health security initiatives across the globe. Previously, I have worked for the State Department for the Population, Refugees, and Migration group, along with the PEPFAR program during Ambassador Birx's tenure, and have worked on multiple responses, including Médecins Sans Frontières or Doctors Without Borders during the Ebola crisis for the Western African response, and have since then kind of really focused on just in general, like assessing, analyzing, and really supporting foreign ministries and also local governments to figure out what is the best approach to figuring out what pandemic preparedness means. If you can tell, that's been really successful. And just basically looking at what the current resources are and what the focus should be along with public health initiatives. So
Yeah, so definitely accomplished even in the short form introduction for sure. But I think the last time we had you on here, we were talking about what was going on at the CDC at the time, because that was the era of the newly released and very flawed isolation guidelines. But I think between Professor Q and some of the other folks in the ministry, at least to get us started, we had some other questions in mind for you, kind of to take your experience in government and prod it from a different direction. So what we had in mind was kind of talking about like how you even got here, like into the CDC in the first place. Like, how does one simply become the CDC? Kind of like that Lord of the Rings meme, right? One does not simply walk into Mordor. How does one walk into the CDC?
for me, I thought about this all day, and when I say all day, I mean the past 2-3 hours when I panic messaged Homo Zygo and said, like, what are we talking about today?
I do that every week. It's fun.
I was like, shit, what are we talking about? It really, what it really came down to was a lot of luck and networking. One of the things I stress that is not taught really well and should be taught better is communications and networking within academia, because a lot of people who are in academia don't really teach you that, nor do they instill kind of the discipline that is required to do a lot of the stuff that you're supposed to do. And also, like, just in general, like, what the heck are you going to do after you graduate, or what the heck you want to do with your degree, right? Like, you do your wet lab, or you do whatever work, and then after, when you get your PhD, it's like the most anticlimactic thing ever, and you're just sitting there going, what now? What? And unless if you are in a profession like a medical degree or justice or anything like that, where you can probably most likely jump into some sort of career right afterwards, a lot of tracks don't lead you that way. And for me, a lot of it was because of the fact that I had a culmination of both. I did an MD PhD route with an MPH specialty, so for me, it was a lot of just like I had the clinical aspects, and then also the fact that my PhD advisor was very well connected with folks at Doctors Without Borders, and basically said that, hey, you should probably do a stint here, during the time when like the whole Ebola crisis was happening. So I said, sure, why not? And over there, I met several folks from the State Department who were also there with USAID, which is another development U.S. agency as well, and really made a lot of great networks, and kind of like talking with them and understanding like what the career paths should be. And they suggested that I speak with like several assistant deputy secretaries at that time. So I did speak with them, and they brought me on board, and that was then. Like, once you get into, the hardest part is getting in, and once you get into government, like, it's very easy to kind of traverse the field to kind of get to where you're at. But I think a lot of times people don't really know what the best optimal path is to get into government service, and it depends on what you want to do. But once you're in, it's, you know, it's high on murder to just like get kicked out. In this case, if you haven't noticed from a lot of the government folks we have, but in general, like, I would say honestly, it was just like luck of the draw, and really just, you know, talking with the right people that helped me got in.
So at least like you actually brought up an interesting point, like right at the end of that, right? Like once you're in, and you basically have to like kill, you know, shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue to actually like get removed from the government. Do you like find that fact to be almost like a detriment to how, whether through the CDC or just other parts of government, like, is that a problem or is that a good thing? Because at least I look on like the Trump administration and I'm like, okay, like how did all of these crazy people actually get into the government? Because like you said, once they're in, they're in.
I mean, it is definitely. Like, I think there's like also different groups of like government. There's also different, like, I guess, echelons of government employees, right? You have those who are politically appointed. And, you know, for those, like, for that point, you really don't have to stress too much, because literally you have the hand of the president and also the executive branch to basically kind of protect you, essentially. If you basically can't do no wrong. And that's what essentially a lot of Trump and his appointment, like basically a lot of his appointments did, was that they just kept bringing in folks from their appointments as well. And then you have like the traditional route, which is like going for usajobs.gov, applying there. And then you go through the whole rigmarole of like doing yearly evaluations to assess what steps you're going to be at. So your GS positions, essentially. And it goes up to like, you know, all the way up to GS15. And then you could decide whether if you want to take a senior executive service examination or certification, which is what I did. So I'm an SES right now. And that's, if for folks who don't know, that's like essentially a level of equivalent in DOD of a general, I guess. But it is like a year-long process where you go through certification to get in that position to be an executive leadership, and you're much more options open up for you at that point.
That's a lot more involved than I really like thought it would be. Like, and that's the thing is, you know, I think me and Greg actually, we're both in grad school. Like, I think Greg is probably closer to graduating than I am. But like, everything you just said was like a different language practically. Like, we do not get exposed to this shit at all. So it's like, how do we find out that like this is even a thing? Like,
you don't.
Aside from the networking, apparently you just don't.
You don't. Literally, it's just a surprise to you once you jump in. But the thing is that like it depends on like if you want to get into government service, right? Like a lot of people don't even realize it until afterwards. Like once they're in graduate studies or postdoc or whatever, that this is an option for them. And a lot of like STEM folks typically don't realize that this is a venue for them to jump into. And I encourage a lot of STEM folks to jump into government service, just because we do need more STEM oriented folks in kind of policy making, and also doing a lot of, you know, the driving of how we're doing, development frameworks. Because when we start talking about like, you know, cyber warfare, or if we start discussing like climate change and everything like that, I don't want to trust, no offense to lawyers, I don't want to trust the lawyer who's next to me to talk about why certain zoonotic spillovers are going to likely occur. I would rather trust the person who studied this their whole life to talk on our behalf. But unfortunately, like, you know, since there's not many of us in that kind of field, what ends up happening in a lot of these kind of like hearings and stuff like that is that they bring in people to kind of do the discussions, and it's kind of like a one-off basis. And after that, it's just back to normal, usual business. And it's very like ineffective and very it's just kind of a Band-Aid solution to how we do science policies. So it's been one of the, I will say, and Homozygo knows this too, like I don't have any like allegiance to any sort of administration or party in this case. I will say the one thing that Biden's group did do successfully in some aspects is integrating a lot more STEM-oriented folks into certain policy positions and encouraging that actually. And that included the State Department as well, where we actually bolstered significantly more level of presidential management fellows and AAAS fellows, which is like a big science graduate thing, to bring in folks talent from different agencies to kind of say like, hey, like we need to start thinking outside the box when we start discussing, trade agreements, or when we need to start thinking about like repercussions of sustainable development, and how do we do that?
Yeah, so Levelhead in the chat actually brings up an interesting question, sort of, I think, in relation to a lot of what you just described, because, one of the, I would say, handful of good things that Joe Brandon and company have actually done, like you said, is actually tried to create more opportunity for, STEM folks to actually be, embedded in government to work and to give their actual, input into policy. I think that was... It culminated in, I think it's a OSTP in the cabinet. It's the first time a scientist has ever held a cabinet position, starting with the Biden administration. But in the event that we get someone like Donald Trump reelected, we have heard, at least in the news media, he was going to, I think, he was going to write an executive order around something called Schedule F in terms of trying to basically like replace all public servants with loyalists. Do you have any like perspective on that from your experience? Like, could he just like wipe the floor and put in a bunch of like Scott Atlas types who just make shit up?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly his goal. Is that one of the things that really kept the administration from going a completely batshit insane was the fact that it was extremely difficult to like push people like Fauci and different like appointees out. And for him to do the Schedule F was essentially a way to kind of answer that problem, quote unquote, and really address like, making certain folks to be the untouchables, or the ones that are really difficult, a lot less difficult, and could be at the whim of the president or his cronies, to his or hers or their cronies, to just do whatever they want. Which, again, it's not a perfect system. I'm not going to say that it's a perfect system, right? Like, there are some folks who do need to retire, Fauci. And the thing is that like, unfortunately, you have a lot of very like old guards that like to stay in services for a long periods of time. And sometimes it is kind of good to kind of have like that, brush burning effect, and just being like clear house a little bit and then bring in fresh new talent and new perspectives. But at the same time, there is a lot of institutional knowledge that unfortunately is needed in a lot of different groups and how to interact and stuff like that. So we suffer a lot of this as well within CDC, is that you still have a lot of people who have gone through several administrations that are still at CDC working through it. The emerging infectious like surveillance, the disease surveillance group, for example, has like most of their leadership is like folks who have survived since the Reagan era. Like, I'm like, I don't even know how you're still able to write papers, let alone like, anyways. Wow. But these are old guards that have sat there for a long time and have garnered respect amongst like the right people. And they also happen to have good relationships with folks who matter, like those in the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which anyone who works in a federal office usually shake whenever they hear that agency's name. And for those of you who don't know in chat, OMB pretty much is the group that really decides whether if you get the money or not every fiscal year. Or like the OIG or any other groups and anything like that. These are folks who know the right folks, and they stay in that position for a long periods of time, and are usually encouraged to stay on, because it's like, okay, well, you have this wealth of knowledge, how businesses run, like we want to keep you here. And I think one of the many things I always giggle about every time the administration turns over is that people like Politico or different groups will always write these like blown out of proportion articles saying like, oh God, like this administration, like there's tons of people leaving. And I'm like, but that's every administration. Like every administration change, we usually end up having a huge clear house of like people leaving. It doesn't matter, Democrat, Republican, it always happens that way. And it's just more of an effect of just in general, like most folks are like that. Sorry.
Are people leaving after an administration change by choice, or are they let go and they have to, find something else?
Most of them are by choice. Most of them are really just by choice, and many times like they get offered a better deal in different places like think tanks or like public-private organizations. And so usually like for them, like if you work in government in a super high level position, like let's say Secretary of State or Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, it's exhausting. Like it is nonstop go. You are just constantly hammered like left and right, up and down. Like after like the 4 years, like most people like are just like, I'm good. I got this on my record. I can write my check to anywhere I want to go. You can go work
It's on
for
my
a
resume. I'm done now.
Yeah.
exactly.
But I mean,
And,
with Fauci retiring, is that going to be? I mean, what do you think? That's kind of like a big shakeup there. Do you think? What do you think about that?
So with Fauci leaving, I'll be honest in that I think that the group NIAID has already, which is the group he leads up, they were already prepared. We have already identified 2 candidates, which I will not say who they are. But we've already identified 2 candidates that could possibly take over his position once he leaves. So this isn't something like, one day Fauci woke up and said, you know what, I'm good. I'm going to retire next year. I'm going to do this. Like, it's very much like a discussion that's being held like years in advance beforehand. And so a lot of these groups usually have like some sort of like nominations or like different groups of people lined up, ready to go. And worst case scenario, what ends up happening is that there's always kind of a lapse in that time period where usually you have an acting individual that will come in to kind of do that work for them. But they're usually pretty prepared to do this anyways. It's not like Fauci's working 24/7, which I guess he does, but usually they'll have someone there to kind of do the backup for them.
So how I guess I'm curious, in a job like that, in a government job, like how is the institutional knowledge kind of carried forward? I mean, obviously you have like people that are right underneath him, but he's been director for so long now. I mean, is it literally like he's going to shadow you or you're going to shadow him? Or here's like your schedule of itinerary, who you report to? Like, how do you, because it's just such an odd, like, N equals 1 position. You know what I mean? It doesn't feel like you could train.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in a situation like Fauci's position, right, where, for Fauci, he leads a very unique position. And I think for those who are in like scientific government fields is that not only are they, co-leading on several research initiatives, but they're also doing a lot of the outreach and the policy development with other agencies. And so one of the things that we focus on, at least like for me, for example, like if I were to be retiring next year, is that like my plan would be to have someone basically shadow me or basically be like with me at every step of every meeting and everything like that. And what eventually happens is that during that year-long process, I slowly start to hand off a lot of these initiatives to them and say, okay, you will lead our defense at the Hill. You will lead this, working group meeting. You will lead this right now. And I am going to back off and focus on what I need to do to close out all of my portfolios. It's actually much smoother, actually, in a lot of ways than what people think. And it's much more gradual. And then obviously one of the many things too, obviously like the usual, like have handover notes and just like all that other stuff. Like we usually end up writing like mountains and mountains and mountains of papers, which is what I did when I left the State Department to my acting subdirector. Was basically like I handed this poor woman like, like a thumb drive of like, 6 gigs of like papers and like all the stuff. I'm like, good luck. Here's all my stuff. But obviously, like I had already been like working with her for the whole year to kind of like really talk about like the different processes and things like that. And, and we still contact on occasion if something happens and they're like, I came across the situation, like, what would you do in this? What would you do? It's not like we cut off connection completely. Like we still talk on occasion, but unless if it's classified, then I don't really talk about that. So,
I mean, how much it seems such a long time. I mean, it's like 3 decades, right? I mean, where man, like the face of the CDC, it seems like, especially in a pandemic or Fauci specifically, it's almost like it's almost like a PR role, right? You're kind of like up there, you're in front of TVs, you're doing a ton of different interviews all throughout the day, a lot of science communication. I mean, it doesn't seem like he's like, I guess, leading the research or something. Or maybe is he along with that? Is that just like all the media appearances on top of it? Because it just seems like two different things, right? Science communication versus research.
So for him, for Fauci and folks like that, they usually at that position would just provide oversight, but they're not intricately involved in it, right? So they would have sub-directors or scientific or PI leads come up to them and give them briefings on what's going on with different labs and things like that. For them, and this is something as well I always stress too, is that even though Fauci might look like he's kind of a lone wolf, he does have a team of people supporting him to do a lot of the communications and the work on the bottom level that helps write up a lot of different talking points, and he works with them to figure out how best to approach certain things. Which, if you can't tell, they haven't been doing a great job as of late. But no shade. So. I think it's just I think in general, when people when a lot of these leaderships tend to shift, you start to realize that a lot of them end up being much more like a recipient of a lot of the information and kind of integrating that and discussing it rather than doing the grunt work. So the people who are doing the grunt work, who understand the data, who really do a lot of the subject matter expertise, they're still doing their job, and they're still going to be able to report to whoever is comes up in the in the next role, whatever it might be. So I don't know if you guys have heard as well that so Ambassador Birx's previous role was the ambassador for the PEPFAR program, which is the largest global HIV initiative worldwide. And when she left, PEPFAR basically didn't have an ambassador at large for God knows how long. And we actually just brought in a new ambassador after 2-3 years right now going, and was an ambassador in Nkengasong. He used to actually lead the Africa CDC, and for him, it's basically for his first week, he just shadowed across all the different divisions and sat in on meetings, and all the division leads sat and talked with him about what are the important factors, what's going on, here's what the countries look like, how are we with antiretroviral treatment delivery, blah 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 blah. He just gets deluge of information. But usually people who are in that position are in that point where they can handle that information overflow and just kind of work with it and work across all those different kind of parallels.
Yeah, so I think this is probably maybe more along the Professor Hugh Grumlow avenue of thinking. But
sure,
one of the things that I think we might have touched on the last time you were here was the idea that kind of you mentioned, obviously there's a big utility for STEM folks to take positions in government, whether it's CDC or whatever. But that doesn't really seem to at least feel it's as wanted or valued in more of the sociology, humanities, aspect of it. Do you agree with that, or not so much?
I can't really comment on that because I'm not that involved with it, but I do. I think one of the many things that we do need, especially with the whole pandemic thing, is that we do need more sociologists and a lot more folks who are outside the typical framework of thinking of how public health works and how science works in general, to kind of look at how policy development happens. And I will say that, yes, there is a much higher need. But when you start trying to talk to different government agencies about bringing in these individual folks, you have to really finely define, what role they will play in the different aspects of it. And most folks who do come on board, who are of the humanities or, of that ilk, have to think about have to wear multiple hats in this case. They're not just doing the stuff with policy development. They might be looking at budget. They might be looking at, performance indicators or whatever it might be. You really have to be, and this is another thing too, I always stress to folks as well. If you come into government service, you need to be prepared to really understand how the federal government operates from all aspects. And money is the biggest one that I see a lot of scientists struggle, is figuring out how our budget process works. Because I will tell you right now, I always say this to everyone who comes on board. I'm like, the budget process here does not make any fucking sense. It is just a clusterfuck of like, okay, well, take a guess as to how many treatments or how much vaccines or how much of this you will need for next fiscal year. I'm like, I don't even know what's going to happen next month, and you want me to predict next year? But then they ding you if you either underspend or if you overspend. So you're kind of like, so you just kind of like have to like do your best to guess based on historical data, or God forbid, if it's like a new pandemic, you got to like really do a good job of like looking at all those different factors. And it's a challenging aspect for most folks.
You could always be clairvoyant.
You can.
Easy.
But we haven't invented that yet.
Yeah, go.
Let me know when you guys
That's not in the
figure that
budget.
out at the CDC, all right?
We can't even figure out our
Clairvoyant
own
brain
shit.
chips, please. Elon, someone.
Oh God.
So I kind of have an interesting question, and Graham, I think is probably like the theory head. You could probably like piggyback on this, but I've just been curious, like as someone like from my perspective who's like kind of close-ish to graduating. Let's say I wanted to get into government. I think we've had a couple of other like panelists on the ministry who were grad students who now actually have their PhDs, but they were actually scared to like go into government because they are outspoken leftists. So from your perspective, like, do you feel like there would be that would actually be an issue if somebody wanted to go into government, if they were self-identifying as a socialist, if they spoke about wanting to make the government pass more or recommend more like leftist democratic socialistic policy? Like, would that be a problem? Would you just would your application get tossed in the trash after they Googled you and looked at your socials for 5 minutes? Like, how much of a problem is political ideology in trying to be a government employee?
I mean, unless if you outright speak about overthrowing the government, I don't find it to be an issue. Like put it to you this way: like, if they run a security clearance for you, can you pass the security clearance? If you can pass the security clearance, you'll be fine. Like, unless if you're sitting there just like saying like Biden should be hanged and all blah 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 blah, like all this sort of stuff, you're going to be fine. Yeah,
I guess if you're
everything.
Yeah, I guess if you're like FOIA is not super, lengthy, then you might be all right.
I mean, put it to you this way: there was someone on a program, some agency, who, before they came on, like, definitely smoked a lot of different drugs. I won't even say which, because you'll identify the person immediately. Has definitely had a very colorful history, sexual history as well. Across multiple countries, and they got in just fine. I think you will be fine. Like, if you happen to just have a much more socialist leaning, that is like that's going to be the most boring fucking thing ever that they're going to see on an application. In fact, we probably need that, to say the least, to come in to kind of bring in that perspective. So
as long as you're not talking about overthrowing the government, you're good.
Yeah, as long as you don't say it, then you're okay. But if you actually try to do it, hey, you might be president one day. So.
Then
That's
again,
we have game after it like Marcus does, then you're fine, because it's just in a video game like Minecraft.
they're like, he is saying he should overthrow the government, but he is talking about the one in Minecraft, so I think we're good.
you're
They
fine.
have government in Minecraft? Yeah, probably. I don't know. My kids play it.
It's probably more organized than ours. So
At this point, yeah. And also there are, people who are saying, no, it's the church is supposed to guide the government. And
No.
they're current sitting Congress people, so no.
Good old Marge.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I had to ask
She's
that one for
come out
Natty.
as a Christian nationalist now, like full on
Mm-hmm.
in her emails.
So are there?
And in pressers.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that too.
It is nuts how
Yeah,
it's
and
forced.
hanging out with the Hitler Youth, so to speak, as they were called recently,
Yeah,
the
but to
Nick
hang out
Fuentes
with
fans.
them and then call yourself one, I feel like those are like, one of those is admitting something to yourself,
Yeah.
True. So, Dr. Neuro, I was curious, like, about like the science careers aspect. So, we're talking about like ways that scientists can kind of like, get involved with the CDC and the government larger? Are there like other roles, other steps that people that don't have a MD, PhD or something can have? Like I'm thinking like something for me that I found out recently were like the national labs. Like that's like a huge thing, where a place where people can work in for the government agencies, the NSF, DOE, all that kind of stuff. But I guess could you talk about like the different roles that people would play like at those agencies as well?
Absolutely. So I think one of the many things that you start to realize that there's a lot of these organizations, not even just like on a national, like federal position, but also local ones as well, is that everyone is hurting for like positions and money. I'll tell you that right now. And that includes every sort of like position you can think of. That includes like PR work, whether if it's like maybe helping them write up certain policy papers. If you want to do, and if you want to do more science related stuff, there are different career paths as well, which I can go into in just a little bit. But like I think one of the many things I encourage folks who are, I guess it also depends on like what you want to do versus like, what you graduate with, right? Like what the kind of career path do you want to go towards? So let's say like an example, and I'm going to do one example, and Greg, you can give me another example or someone else. But like, let's say if you graduate with a master's degree in public health. One of the things I encourage everyone to do, and like in a lot of these positions, is like it doesn't even have to be like. And I see a lot of MPHs. What they do is like they go to doing budget formulations for local organizations. Because the problem is that you see a lot of accountants who will do the work, but they don't know the story behind numbers. So if you go there and you tell them like, okay, well, we need to start cutting programs, or we need to start like figuring out how to prioritize certain funding streams, having an MPH there who understands like the context of the situation and being like, okay, well, we need to ensure that our funding is going to these underserved communities versus, the rich white neighborhoods, or we need to ensure that we're prioritizing funding for transportations of vaccines to certain underserved areas, or making sure that we are supporting faith-based organizations in local areas who have a broader reach. Like these are things that accountants don't think of, right? Because all they see is just numbers. But having someone there to guide a lot of those discussions is something that's critical as well. Now, that being said, like it doesn't even have to be like, something as like grassroots as that. If you want to go to larger think tanks as well to help develop pieces, that's something as an alternative that you can do as well, along with some of the national non-governmental organizations that do a lot of groundwork as well in different places internationally, should you want to do that. Or I've seen a lot of folks who go to like, Latin-based organizations to serve a lot of the Latino-based organizations because they said that, they'll say that, oh, well, we don't have enough people on the ground to actually focus on communications and chatting with people on the ground to figure out like, where are the weaknesses in our health delivery and where do we need to go? One of the best examples I say is like where we have a huge gap is our Native Americans and indigenous population response. They're always hurting. They always need more people to come in to kind of support visibility and responses for that. And having people, it doesn't matter what your background is, like having people there to help do a lot of the grunt work and to kind of support that. One, it fills your resume, and two, you're supporting organizations that really need the manpower to do a lot of it. Because you see a lot of these organizations, and it's usually 2-3 people who wear 16 different hats doing a billion things at once. And it's not sustainable for a lot of them. And they end up getting burnt out. And you'll see like the responses just become, the funding just starts to trickle down. And it's very hard. It's unfortunately very hard to do a lot of development work for that. But I don't know if there's another specific example you want to think of for me to kind of like help draw like a potential pathway for that.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. I learned recently kind of like the amount of money that's so disproportionately that's for science, like going into DOD. It's insane. Mm-hmm. It's more than all the other agencies combined. NSF, yes. NIH, DOE, all of them lumped together. The DOD does so much science. It's just, it was very shocking to hear that.
It is, because it's very easy to defend the defense budget's science spending, because you'll just everything you basically say, it's for security purposes. And they're like, oh, well, 6 billion approved right there. We can't say no to security. Cyber warfare. Yeah, that sounds pretty important. Put that money right there. Earmark it, or we're done.
Good old America.
But like you go to NIH, which NIH, I have my gripes with them too. Like when they defend certain projects and things like that, it's hard to really say like, okay, well, we're pumping in money to look at potential therapeutics. The chances of most of them succeeding is very low. And the idea of like people, like, when you try to go to like a lot of these defense appropriators and stuff like that, or just appropriators in general, and say like, hey, I would like to earmark an additional $5 million towards diabetes research. A lot of them will just be like, we'll just tell people to eat better. That's a cheaper way to do it, right? Which I've heard actually people say that. It's very, unfortunately, this is the problem again, when we have a lot of people who are making these high level decisions for appropriations and money and how it's being spent. These are folks who are not STEM folks, who are not scientific. They're very smart and very cunning, but when it comes down to it, a lot of them don't like the idea that scientific spending that's outside of the DoD sphere moves at a glacial pace and doesn't always necessarily produce the results immediately. And of course, like, a lot of them are like, oh, well, we like to see something done within one fiscal year. And you're like, I can barely get test subjects within a one fiscal year when you want me to fix what? So it's like a bit of a catch-22 when you have to deal with that aspect.
So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
When you say think tank, my first thought is Heritage Foundation. And so I'm just under the impression that think tanks are evil, like science skin dwellers that aren't actually doing science. So can you like, are they not all evil, like I've been told to believe?
The really loud ones, unfortunately, are very evil. But there are certain ones that actually do pretty decent work. Like there's some humanitarian agency think tanks that really kind of focus, like, are very critical of the governments, which is why you don't hear them quite often, because we don't really talk about them. We're just like, oh, I can't believe so-and-so said that about our group. We're not going to talk about it. But there are different like think tanks that are out there that do really great work. And also sometimes they also focus on much more targeted issues that aren't like as visible or trending within a national news cycle. So you probably are not going to hear too much about them. The ones that typically get a lot of limelight that you'll see are the ones like Heritage Foundation or whatever that'll release papers that say millennials are causing the economic crash of 2022. That they should probably eat less avocado toast. Here's our analysis, and it's complete bullshit. But there are some really bad ones, and unfortunately they're the loudest and probably have the most money, given the fact that there is special interest in them. But I will say that there are some decent ones out there. You just have to really dig through a lot of shit to get to the gems, and really just focus on that. And unfortunately, when you're like a graduate student and you're finishing up, it's like, look, like you want a job that pays. And a lot of these smaller think tanks are not going to give you the most, the best, like wages or anything like that. When you go to a Heritage Foundation, they're just like, okay, so we'll start you off at like 80, 90 grand a year to just start the initial writing. And you're kind of like, okay, well, I need to feed myself. And so you kind of join these organizations. And I've seen so many people just get burnt out so much after joining these. And it's hard. So I won't say that it's like they're kind of like a weird necessary evil, unfortunately, within the DC area and a lot of these different places.
It's kind of like lobbyists, right? Where it's like lobbyists, it's like a negative word and a connotation, and a disproportionate amount of money is going, like, for example, the environment, right? The environment, the coal lobby, the gas lobby have like a disproportionate amount of money going towards it. But like technically when I was going and lobbying my local, like, California, Congress people about graduate student issues, especially when they were going to tax our tuition, and it was going to increase the bills for grad students by like $10,000 a year or something. Like, technically, I was a lobbyist. It's kind of a weird thing, but.
And how did you feel? How well were you supported from that government? Did you feel?
when I was there, when I was talking to him, I mean, it's just kind of like, oh, okay, that's cool. You're talking with the staffer, you're not really like necessarily even talking to them, but it's, especially I'm a dad too. So I'm a grad student parent, which is like an even smaller, weird slice of the pie. So that's its own challenges, but it is frustrating, when you feel like you're going up against people that's their job is to lobby, right? They're there like 40 hours a week. They're making these connections, and then you're just like, hey, I got a story for you, but getting your elevator speech. You only have 15 seconds. What are you gonna say? So it's like it's tough. It is tough.
And it doesn't get any better. I'll say that the higher up you go, like even like for even some of the nationally critical issues and things like that, what you see in a lot of news cycles where people are like, they're defending in the Hill for about an hour or two. And I'm like, I'm lucky if I got 30 minutes to talk about, coronavirus like responses or pandemic preparedness. Like that's just like the reality, unfortunately, with a lot of like these initiatives and how they're kind of panned out in hearings and stuff like that. Half an hour. Because what they do is like they jam pack it all in one day. And they're just like, okay, well, after climate control, then it's you. And then after that, we would like to talk to Department of Energy about this thing. And then after that, we need to talk to them about, wastewater, blah, blah, blah. Like everyone has
30 minutes to tell us how the world is ending from the way that you were talking about.
It's crazy. I mean, especially the staffers, if you go in there, like you were talking about the AAAS fellows, or you could, be at the state level. This is a path that I was considering for a little bit, but now I don't know. I'm interested in your thoughts on that. Cause I had a mentor tell me that it's kind of like an end of career idea, not really a good idea, like at someone that's at the beginning of their careers. But the idea is like, they're like, okay, we have a vape pen legislation coming up. Okay, so you need to go out and like review all the vape pen literature, and then you're gonna take 1,000 pages of literature, can review it and condense it down to 30 pages, and then write a 1-paragraph abstract and then a 1-sentence executive summary, and then they maybe we'll read the executive summary. You're like, damn it.
Yeah, that's welcome to government service 101 for most people. Like that's what you'll end up doing like for the first like few years. I wouldn't say it's end of career thing. It's just very arduous for the first few years. Like you go through a grueling process the first few years because you are the grunt workers at that point, right? You're the ones who are reviewing the literature, doing the data crunching. You are the ones who are drafting out the policy papers. And then you have assholes like me who review it and be like, this doesn't make sense. Why did you write this? And then I'll throw it back at you. No, I don't do that. But in general, like you would do it, and then I would be the one to present a lot of those talks and those points to that. But part of the process of AAAS and Presidential Management Fellowship or a lot of these other fellowships is that it's the easiest way for a lot of STEM folks to kind of get into government service without having to go through the whole usajobs.gov, which if anyone who's tried to apply for government jobs can tell you it is the worst process. And it's like such an archaic, like, I don't know I still don't understand the system to this day of like when they vet through resumes, because when you apply for a job on that website, like they have like an AI that's in the background that literally scans your submission. And if you don't say certain key phrases, or if you don't, or if you don't like, respond a certain way, it automatically rejects it, and no human eye sees your resume and then gets to someone else after that's vetted. And it's like a good 80% of those resumes don't make it through that crunch process.
Do you have any idea what some of those key phrases are?
I wish I knew.
Probably on the ones in the CV or in the job description itself. I would imagine it's just seeing if you would match up with those key phrases, which is like, by the way, how you should write your resume or CV. Just repeat back the job description and say that you've done that.
Well, put it to you this way. I had a colleague of mine who just graduated from Brown, and has like their CV is like 17 pages long of publications they've done. They're well accomplished. They applied for a senior research policy position, well overqualified. Didn't make it even through the algorithm.
Wow, what?
But that's just because I don't know what they said. I was just like, what the hell did you you cuss at the algorithm? What did you do?
Seriously.
But these are just different. That's so a lot of times I tell people, especially when you're first starting off, when you don't have that like, backup, it's good to have these fellowships because it is a much easier way to get into service. Because again, getting in is the hardest. And once you're in, like the first few years are going to be super difficult because you're going to be doing a lot of grunt work. You're going to be doing stuff that you thought you were going to be making changes, and you start to have this horrible existential crisis that you're like, oh God, like I can't make changes. I can only like write papers and hopefully someone reads it. And you eventually move up and up and up. And that's where you start to like have a much better grasp of like who the key players are, how you need to talk and how you need to do stuff. And some people don't really make it through it really. Like they'll go through the first year of like those fellowships and they said, no, it's not for me. And they go work for Gates Foundation or some other organization that's probably better for them. But, and that's fine too. Like, it's just, again, like, what do you want to do? Like, do you truly want to do policy development? Do you truly want to get ingratiated with a lot of the politics of these agencies and the work? If you can handle that, you will be an asset in these organizations. I'm not trying to like paint a rosy image for people who want to consider government service. But at the same time, I do encourage people who have that strength to come on board, because we do need people who can weather a lot of these personalities, a lot of the type of politics that are in there, to focus on developing a lot of these frameworks, right? To have these hard discussions and say like, hey, folks, have we considered doing a vaccine surveillance for monkeypox? We don't have one yet. And everyone will look around the table and be like, I don't know, I didn't even think about that. And you would have to be the one who initiates that discussion. So these are things that you have to do, and you have to, unfortunately, like really pull up your pants to do so.
What are our monkeypox cases looking like right now? Because last I looked, it was like 700.
Oh, can we? Okay, back. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Your face is really making me nervous.
It's high. It's high. U.S. is right now leading in cases.
Number worst.
Yeah, we have to be number one in everything.
At the last time you looked.
Yeah,
like,
I'm checking.
I guess I could just Google it instead of just fucking asking. But...
Yeah, the CDC map says 4,907 as of today.
You're joking.
Yeah, the real number is going to be higher, like by a decent margin.
So Neuro, how, like, you're the people that would push that would kind of say like, hey, I need this. I mean, this is a gap in our knowledge, and we need to study that. I mean, how does that different than like a program manager? Because program manager, I took my IDP science careers thing through, and that was actually rated really high on my like what job that would suit me well. And I was like, I've never heard of it, and I looked into it, and it sounds freaking awesome. One of my friends is actually an assistant program manager at DOE right now, and he basically he was like working in algae biofuels before, and then now he just reads a bunch of algae biofuels papers, says which technologies like are working and what they should fund, and it seems like he's like consulting with the labs, telling connecting the dots a little bit. It seems like a really cool like avenue for a lot of people.
Absolutely, that's certainly a career path. Again, like private organizations or any like organizations outside the federal space typically will have a lot more room for like, I would say, like creativity growth, or if you want to do much more of the intense science lab work or much more ingratiated in science. Again, like if you get into the federal aspect, you can't just do science for the sake of science. It has to map to some sort of strategic initiative. Does it map to some policy? Does it match what the president wants to do, right? Like, or different things. And luckily, with this administration, it's a little easier, because last administration, even like saying like, oh, well, we want to like talk about climate change, you would get X'd out immediately. You would not be allowed to do that initiative. You couldn't even have that discussion with anyone. But here, it's just like, okay, well, we need to bring these initiatives to the table and have these discussions. Like, when you compare that program manager friend of yours, like they probably would bring it up to their CEO or COO, whoever or CTO, and be like, hey, we have this cool idea and everything like that. If it's within their budget, they can just easily throw down money and say, let's get this funded and get this work done. It's a lot more agile, much faster, because it is much more focused on that type of lab work. But when you start talking about it from a federal perspective, everything has to map some sort of initiative or objective or strategic paper, whatever it might be that is aligned to that. I can't tell you the amount of times I've sat there and have done the Kevin Bacon 6 degrees of like, separation of being like, well, we need to do this because it maps to this and then it does that and it maps to this paper. Isn't this wonderful? And, by that time they're asleep on the table and I'm like, okay, cool. But that's kind of what you have to do, really, and it's a lot more roundabout, and that's what a lot unfortunately discourages a lot of like scientists from going into the federal field because you're not given that freedom per se. But if you can, but here's the thing too, and this is the counter argument I always tell people is like, if you push through and you persevere and you do get those initiatives on there, like. A lot of that can be turned towards actionable policies, and that's what matters in a lot of like these like types of fields. So things like the Center for Analytics right now that CDC is initialized with Mark Lipstitch and team, things like that, that was like a year-long battle for them to kind of get this type of like advanced pandemic like analytics and surveillance group out there. But we were able to work with the different divisions of CDC and said, hey, like this is going to be important for us to figure out how best to figure out hotspots before they happen, figure out like what are the weaknesses in our areas and things like that, and see how best we can, gear our responses for this. And because it matched the initiatives of what we're doing right now, which luckily for COVID, it's like everything, it's easier to do so. And again, one of the things I had stressed for people who do want to get into a lot of these like kind of federal space to do become a scientist in the federal space is like really understanding the federal government, right? Like it doesn't matter what your political leanings are, but if you really want to make a difference and say like, if you want to do climate research, read the room, right? Like if you're not going to get into a Trump presidency with the idea that you're going to do climate change research, like I would laugh you out of the room and I would tell you to go somewhere else. And find a better job because you will not succeed, or nor will you do work that matters in the federal space.
So if you're a climate change scientist and you're working under the Biden administration and someone like Trump gets voted in, do you like have to go into hibernation for 4 years? Do you change your topic? Do you just leave? Like
you either leave, or what ends up happening, and I noticed, so State Department used to have they have like a group called the Oceanic Climate Energy Initiative Group and everything like that. What they ended up doing is just like reprioritizing research and reprioritizing like topics they were looking at. So
pollution now.
Well, you have people who will come in, and a lot of times, and this is what Trump did very well when he was in office, is that he injected so many people everywhere as his, spies. I'm just going to put it out there right now. And they would observe everything and just be like, hey, like, that's not what, big old Trumpy wants to do. Well, you want to reconsider this initiative and everything? And they did this actually a lot with the PEPFAR program because, and this is something of a story I share with everyone. When Trump first came into office, his biggest initiative was focusing on that we need to prioritize funding for faith-based organizations. So it gets better. And then his second approach was, okay, PEPFAR, I know you're big on HIV and AIDS. Let's put 10%, let's earmark 10% of your funding towards abstinence-only education.
Sick.
That shit works, right?
no.
But here's the thing is that we're all sitting here and Ambassador Birx at that time, this was her face the whole time.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my God. It was so brilliant. Oh my God. Guys, 10% of that funding that you're doing for treatment that's working, that's actually helping people, let's put it into this. And we're all just sitting here going, okay. So what do we do with those people who are still on treatment? We'll figure something out. And I'm like, okay, cool. But like that's what happens is that they just come in and they reshuffle things and like remind a lot of different organizations, like, here's the prioritization of the president, and we should be focusing on that, or the Secretary of State, and you need to follow suit. Now, that's not always the case. Trump is like the outlier in many situations. Many times, a lot of organizations, what they do is they will reappoint new people to a lot of senior leadership positions of the normal way. And those people will help drive the organization's like policies, initiatives, and prioritization. And it's a much more slower, less deliberate process. But in terms of like how Trump did it, he basically like strong-armed his way through every single organization and said, yeah, like that thing about climate change, I don't want to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That thing about like, men who have sex with men, education, stuff like that. Yeah, don't talk about that. Like, we actually, I put up a policy paper when he first came in, and we were talking about outreach towards like the LGBT populations in Tanzania. I had to somehow craft a paper that talked about how we helped LGBT people without saying LGBT people.
Just help people, random people.
So you can imagine. I termed it key populations. I'm like, we addressed funding and blah 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 for these key populations and everything, and in these types of areas.
You put the corporate Memphis spin on it.
That's what you had to do to survive at that point, and a lot of organizations had to do that, and a lot of the culture is still kind of reeling still from it, in a lot of ways for that. So
what's the point in surviving in that scenario, though? Because like Birx has come out and she said that like she didn't agree with all of this, that she knew that Trump's decisions were making, costing people their lives. Fauci, thought the same ones. And I mean, there's specific cases, like for example, when the DHS overruled the CDC on how they should quarantine those people that were coming off the cruise ships. And instead of quarantining them and testing them, they went in with no PPE and just let those people go into an airport that was actually that I lived nearby, but it's not personal to me, but it's like, it's just so mind numbing. Like how doesn't the CDC have like some type of, like, we have funds, we have people, we can literally like do things like stop me, like arrest me from trying to put my PPE on,
We don't have authorities. CDC does not have authorities. This is the unfortunate factor, and I think a lot of people, and it's no fault of anyone, like a lot of people misunderstand CDC's role as a public health agency is that we can make suggestions and we can make guidance and we can help a lot of places enforce things, but we do not ourselves, like we cannot jump in and do the enforcement ourselves. But the problem is, here's the thing is that when people ask me like, well, who does? And I'm like, I don't know, like the local organizations, if they're willing to cooperate or anything like that. I mean, look at the case of Florida, for example. You have DeSantis, who appointed that anti-vaxxer, turd muffin as his, chief medical officer, who's leading a lot of that health response. We can't do anything about it. We don't have the authorities to do so. Even when like the, national mask mandate, like one Floridian lawyer, can we sense a trend here? Completely dismantled it, and we weren't able to do anything. Like, we basically had to go back to the drawing board with the DOJ and the president to figure out how we should attack it, because like a lot of how we operate in an emergency is based on very old like statutes and acts and all these policy stuff that we laid like way back in the day, and we haven't updated them. And as a result, a lot of lawyers these days can like look through and just be like, well, this doesn't constitute as an national emergency, and you can't do it this way. And, being lawyers, no offense to them, will grab those points and defend it and end up bypassing a lot of these like acts and everything. And our authorities basically get shot down the shithole. And that's essentially what's happening right now with a lot of how CDC is doing. And, I get a lot of flack on Twitter and everything because people will just be like, why can't CDC do this? I'm like, we can't do anything. We cannot force people. We can't mandate things. We can suggest a mandate. We can put the data forward and everything like that. But it ultimately comes down to whether if the president agrees with us and he's willing to enforce it on his side, and how we work through that, and if there is precedent in place to have us be able to enforce a lot of these aspects. But we just don't have that power. And part of the discussion, and this is like, if there was a very fascinating webinar that was done at Harvard with all the previous CDC directors, and every single one of them will tell you right now that like CDC, when they came in, they started to realize how limited CDC's role was in a lot of the big decision-making aspects. And look no further, actually, this is a big example. I tell people, like, this is a big case example of why CDC is kind of like shorthand in a lot of ways. Who's leading the White House coronavirus task force right now? Who's the head person right now over there?
Isn't it Ashish Jha right now?
Ashish Jha is not CDC. But he's the one who's at the helm right now advising the president and the coronavirus task force. So tell me where Rochelle Walensky or any of the people who should be up there talking on their behalf, why is she not up there? She was not even at the freaking White House like discussion on the next gen vaccines. She wasn't invited.
I mean, that's actually kind of an interesting point because, like, I mean, you've probably heard me say this a million times, but like, I call Rochelle. I mean, she is like almost to me the epitome of like a careerist political appointee, like not necessarily the like best fit for the job, and I think a poor communicator. But like, regardless of who it is, like, yeah, you're right. Like that, there should be connections between the executive branch and the CDC in that respect, and that's actually surprising. I didn't put those two together.
We don't have the pull for the executive branch. I mean, like, it's a step up though in terms of like the fact that we now have like an Office of Science and Technology policy group in the White House that literally does like science on behalf of the White House. Like it literally came into fruition like within this administration, and it shocks a lot of people when I tell them that. I'm like, well, we didn't have that before, and we're like, not really. But even then, they're kind of a shit show because they're kind of all over the place and have not really been able to like strategically position themselves. And depending on who's the next president, they might not last. So that's also another problem, right? Is that science moves at a glacial pace, but the administration changes every 4 years. So can you imagine trying to accomplish scientific initiatives with an administration that changes prioritizations every 4 years?
So I mean, this all just feels like, you know, an elaborate moving of deck chairs around on what kind of feels like a sinking ship sometimes. Like, where's the stability?
The stability is in the workforce. It sounds cliche, but it's the workforce that stays and continues to do the work. I will say this right now, as someone who has worked in the federal space for a long time, I still will, and I'm very proud of being a federal employee in many aspects. Is that you have a lot of dedicated people in the federal space who want to do the right thing. A lot of people, there's a lot of great people in CDC, NIH, FDA, not HHS, I'm teasing. There's a lot of good people out there who want to do the work, and we're trying, and it's very hard to navigate a very convoluted field that is marred with political initiatives and bureaucracy in many aspects. And we've made strides. I won't say that we haven't. Like, since Biden started, we've been tearing down so many of the regulatory like restrictions that were put in place. We've streamlined so many like processes to get important critical think pieces up to the White House. We have people up there that are actually willing to vouch for us. You know, like these are things that we never had with the 45th administration. It's a very slow process, and I think a lot of people who come onto like the federal space expect things to move at a Operation Warp Speed, and I'm like, the only thing that's going to be fast is if you commit something that's like heinous, and like then the security escorts you out. That's like probably the fastest thing they'll ever do in the federal space. But like everything else just like moves so slow, and you just have to understand this and work with the system and figure out how best you can insert yourself and add value to a lot of these. And for me, it's a lot of times like I get labeled as like the CUNT in the room, because I usually end up calling people out and saying like, these processes don't make sense. Where's the efficiency here? Why aren't we talking about this? But if I don't do that, no one will, right? And a lot of people don't want to be in that position. Many people want to just go get the work done and leave. And if that's the case, then maybe
or they're like women who, or another like marginalized group who have been taught to like stay silent and not cause confrontation like that.
Absolutely.
Because I've done that quite a few times where I've noticed something but haven't said anything because I didn't want that confrontation.
Absolutely. And you raised another good point too about like talks of like the inclusivity and to ensure that there's equitable, like accessible discussions in a lot of these areas. And we have made a lot of efforts these past 2 years to really focus on getting a lot of the folks who were suppressed a lot of the past few years to start speaking up. A lot of people are still scared to talk openly, because that's how much terror was reigning for 4 years before Biden came in. And we are still right now trying to repair the damage that he has wrought in a lot of these science-based organizations. And we're very tenuous because we're scared that like, okay, well, if we do something, like, is it going to last for 4 years, or is the orange turnip going to come back in after 4 years and we all have to go back down into our burrows? Like, these are legit fears that people have. And and it's a legitimate concern. Yes.
So do people feel like if they do speak out and try and work alongside the Brandon admin that they're actually going to be heard, or is there kind of a malaise that they feel given the kind of inaction we've seen thus far?
There's a bit of malaise. There is. I'm not even going to try to sugarcoat that either. We are unfortunately in a weird, horrible situation right now where everything is a priority right now within the administration. It took a lot of us fighting to get like more stuff on long COVID being discussed, right? It's why Ikiko Iwasaki's voice is very critical in that, because she went to defend the Hill to talk about that. And a couple of other folks like our group right now. So I pretty much in the CDC side of the house work with the working group there to discuss long COVID. And we always push these initiatives to kind of like say, like, let's not forget these discussions when we're having policy level development or if we're doing our plan book or anything like that. And you get met with a lot of just kind of like, well, I suppose it depends if like we get the money, or if the appropriators decide this is important, or if this is whatever. And you have a lot of burnt out people on that. Just translates to malaise sometimes within certain key positions.
How do we figure out how to like push forward and make progress, but then like because I feel like we have to combat some of this like nihilistic tendency to like against our institutions right now, where it's like all of like science and the government, especially I feel like with social media, and it's so easy to be so negative constantly, but I feel like there is progress being made, but people don't talk about it. And then it's easier to say that nothing's happened than being educated on the things that are happening.
And that's a great question. And I know this was actually posed in a other think tank discussion we had. First things first is bringing in new people. Like, an organization is only going to be complacent and remain in the rut if it doesn't inject new life and new thoughts and processes into it. But here's the thing, is that on the counter side, we as the government agency need to make it more appealing. We need to be much more open about the fact that, and like going out to recruit these people, going out to academia and saying, bringing in these talents and making it easier for them to do that work, because we don't do a good job of that. I'm going to be the first one to say that right now. So that's the first one, is bringing in that kind of like from the bottom up, like new talent. Second being the fact that we need to make sure and put in place for a lot of these scientific organizations and the federal spaces protections to ensure that the work that they're doing is to be completed within the time that they're supposed to, with this funding that they need, without stress from the administration coming down on them. We don't need to stress out more about the fact that we're not going to be able to perform well, but the fact that we're doing high risk and we're doing high, very theoretical work that could potentially help a lot of people. And we need to have that kind of protection. It's kind of like what DARPA and DoD does. Like, they do a lot of high risk experiments and projects. And maybe 0.1% of those projects actually succeed, but they don't have to worry because they have DoD backing them up to say it's okay, guys. Here's another $6 million. Have fun. Go play with that. We don't have that in our side outside of the DoD space, and we need to have that. And to ensure that if folks do come in and let's say in the current administration are doing climate research, they should not have to worry about will the next president dismantle everything that I'm doing? Will they really screw up everything? I wouldn't even be able to publish my work in Nature or whatever magazine if next president comes in and bans my research. That protection should be in place. So that's the second one. The third thing really comes down to really kind of we need to be much more better about our PR and our what we are doing from the back end in a lot of the scientific development from the federal space about what's happening and what are some successes we're doing. The amount of work that goes into us crunching the numbers, by the way, from local hospitals to the national database in the CDC to clean up is ginormous. But no one hears about the work that group is doing. You don't hear about that. The only time you hear about it is when we fuck up, and that's not a good thing for a public health agency. Is that we're not sure, we're more likely to shine light on our inefficiencies and our faults than celebrating the successes of all the people who do that grunt work and doing all that stuff. And that's something that I feel is very lacking. And the final one I'll say right now for me is really ensuring and fortifying our position in the executive branch of a science and technology group to have a voice in, different very key hearings and stuff like that, because there's been so many times where I have sat in a room full of lawyers, full of economists, and they will try to argue with me to the ground about why we should reduce certain HIV testing regimen to save an extra $600 million for the U.S. taxpayers' money. And I tell them that's not feasible because if you lose that testing, you lose people to AIDS in the process, and people will die with that decision. And that does not register in a lot of those folks' minds. They just see dollar signs.
Man, that's crazy that you're saying about aggregating the COVID data, because other than the CDC papers that go out, I didn't even know that happens. I go to the New York Times for the aggregated data.
Mm-hmm. But even then, they take a lot, the way they take a lot of processed data from us and a lot of processed data so there's an intermediate database that we take from as well that aggregates all the local hospital data as well. And a lot of times newspapers, they kind of take their own, they take a stab at it their own way and do a better job of visualizing. And there's just none of that real talk about it. We don't talk about the amount of grunt work that goes into it. There was that one time, I think several months ago, I don't know if Homozygo remembers the whole drama with this one, where we screwed up one of the percentages with pediatric cases, severe cases of COVID. And the internet just went ham with all these irresponsible scientists and doctors who are just the CDC should not be having these mistakes and everything, hang them and stuff like that. We had people message me saying that. And I'm okay, well, for one, like, you don't understand the volume of data that we're getting, the amount of work that these people do to put that data in a readable format, and then also making sure that we're verifying all that data. But it's not something we just randomly say, oh, this person had, myocarditis, just add it in. We have to verify it, right? Like, there's a lot of like back and forth that happens that ensures that we have a weekly update. And it's just, and some people argue we should have it daily. And I'm like, if we have daily, no one would ever sleep at that poor office. And you would burn everyone out, like literally burn everyone out, just because they just would not be able to do so. And that part of it really is just like answers to questions like, how sustainable can it be if you continue forcing people to do that? But that's it.
No, I mean,
easy.
Like, just like when you put all that
The more I learn
together,
about
like,
this, the less I like it.
I love it.
That's fine. That's fine. I am not trying to paint a rose-colored image here. I want to make sure I'm honest about it. If anyone who has ever talked to me or has been to my stream or I've come to here, I will not try to paint a rosy image. I will be honest about it. I will still vouch and I will still push for people to continue part of it. But I know many folks, and especially in this channel and others, it's like, we want to be able to push for much more progressive scientific development in federal spaces. But until we get more people in there, we're not going to. Like, you're going to have old dinosaurs like Francis Collins and all these other people who literally are sitting there just being like, I had no idea anti-vax would be this bad. And it's just like, but you have people like that sitting here defending our organization and making policies. And you start to wonder, like, how do we fix this? And really it comes down to like bringing like, folks who have that much more, what I say, like reality and like modern like takes on a lot of stuff and understanding the context of our current burdens on health systems. And I should not have to sit here and remind policymakers that like, not everyone can take a day or two off if they get the vaccine and they get knocked out, because that's money for food on the table. And sometimes they literally, and I kid you not, I have sat and they would be like, I had no idea this was an issue. And I'm like, well, what do you think they pay groceries with? Like, like, do you understand that half your constituents are living paycheck to paycheck? Like, where do you think that money comes from? And a lot of that comes from like these, like a lot of the fresh talent we bring in who understand equity and accessibility for a lot of underserved populations and things like that. Like, you don't get that from a lot of these old fossils and dinosaurs. Like, they're kind of in their ivory palace just saying like, hey, let's focus on the next thing. Let's do this. And not thinking about the groundwork that needs to happen, really.
Yeah. So how do we get involved? So then how do we get more science people involved? Because like, I guess my question would be like, is it getting scientists to become policymakers, or is it teaching politicians about science? Because there's a difference. Like at my campus, there's this new group that like, it was like science to policy. And I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. We're bringing scientists to policymakers to like help advise or, or lobby or whatever like that. But it was literally just like graduate classes about like becoming a lawmaker, writing policy papers and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, I don't know if that's like what I want to be a scientist still, but then I want to like have an impact and create science-based policies.
Sure. I think it's going to be both, right? It's a culture change. Like how we have done politics in the past and how we have done our defense of every year, how we do business is always in a vacuum of its own. And it's not really with the consideration of science. That culture needs to change, really, and it's sort of started changing. You have different groups who do come up there, who lawmakers and senators and folks like that who do have a little bit of understanding of scientific, and they do have like a group of people who help them like understand it too. And it's slowly changing, but again, you need to have good science communicators up on a lot of these policy level decisions. not every scientist is a good science communicator. Not every doctor is a good science communicator, as we've come to realize. And that if you have that talent, I think you would be such an asset. I personally would think you would be such an asset to the federal space, because if you can go up there and communicate the importance of ensuring rapid tests are available to everyone in underserved communities, and how you can actually map that to dollars saved, you would be a unicorn in my eyes, and I would covet you so bad. But we don't have folks like that. No one talks about it. Marcus would have to go through a lot of rigmarole before working for me. He doesn't get preferential treatment. Okay, I'm going to basically hand him like 60 billion papers from any like New England, and be like, synthesize all of this, okay? And then when he sends me papers, I like red mark everything. I'm like, terrible. Go back.
Well, I mean, that'll be the best part, is that's all of grad school. It's just getting your stuff filled with red comments and Microsoft Word by your advisors. So we'll fit right in.
Google Docs. I mean, you guys aren't even on Google Docs. Still on Microsoft Word. There you go. Yeah, that's old school still.
Yeah, there's institutional rot for you. Review changes on Microsoft Word.
Exactly. Renting out the Microsoft Word document, like literally. Oh man.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
So we kept all of our mouse records on one Excel sheet, and it was like 7,000 mice. The Excel sheet took like 20 minutes to load every time. So I feel you on the institutional rot shit.
There's an XKCD comic where they talk about the complexities of data, and like how eventually it plateaus at like, what is it, like a church spreadsheet of like 600 like 6 million rows or something like that. And I laugh about it every time, because that's like pretty much how the federal government works. We have like 1 trillion Excel spreadsheets and nothing mapping to each thing. It's kind of insane.
Well, so like, I think kind of like, speaking of synthesizing, a lot of the picture that you paint, I think further underscores the notion that we're kind of almost living through like the apex of the whole like Reagan-esque starve the beast like approach to government, because just the sheer like day-to-day like dysfunction that you describe, it all I think really stems down to like lack of resources, lack of people, and lack of competent people to carry out all of the necessary duties.
Lack of a value set that's appropriate for the industry. Or industry. See what I just did there? Got it in my own brain.
But like, I think someone in chat mentioned it. Like, it's all of this is designed so that people instinctively turn to industry instead of government when there are ails in society, whether it's a pandemic like COVID. People will reflexively say, okay, when's Pfizer giving me the next treatment, instead of, okay, how is the government tackling this problem that's like affecting the country? Like we're at a point where we're more dependent on corporations for our general well-being and welfare than the government in some capacity. So, I mean, that's less of a question. I guess just more of a connection on a thread. Like, it takes so much effort and time to rebuild what needs to be maintained in government to fend off all of the people who are like the Trumps and the Reagans, who are there to like engage in Schedule F policy, fire more.
Marcus, I'm going to hold on for just a second. I need to go get the door really quickly. I will be right back.
Marcus, we can't do any of that stuff. We have to establish a commission in order to study if there's a problem, in order to see if it exists, that there is a... it's like these like weird bureaucratic things that I feel like it's in good faith, but I feel like it's like kind of like we haven't even figured out the internet, you know what I mean? And how like these things like mash and get them together. Just seems...
I think that's what Fank was saying in chat. Like, we can't depend on like politicians to like figure out the internet and shit. Like they don't know that ads get run on Facebook. Like,
yeah, for real.
I have little faith we could convince them to like listen to scientists, but who knows? Maybe I'll be wrong. I'd like to be wrong.
It would be great to actually have like science policy, like to actually have science like try different things out, and to have like look at the methods and see which one goes first and then go forward with that, rather than it just seems, or maybe it's happening already and I don't know that it happens, Dr. Neuro, but like there's just we kind of have it kind of like with cities at the city level, where every city kind of like tries stuff, but like Compton did UBI, that went really well, stuff like that, where it's like, okay, so now what's the next step? So I'm curious, like, could it happen within the federal government? Could we try out different things, or is that even fair? Because like, for example, a big thing is like, you can't even do the negative control during the COVID vaccines because that would be unethical, because you can't give people a negative control during a pandemic. That's insane. So it equal treatment, right? That's kind of the whole idea.
I think with situations like that, like we do have, a lot of, this is the reason why we established BARDA essentially for HHS to do a lot of these, kind of like those kind of experiments, or kind of like being able to do trials or to do things that are outside the normal scope or outside of like, the regulatory eye, not regulatory eyes, that sounds bad. Basically like the bureaucracy that usually impinges a lot of these organizations from doing so. And essentially BARDA functions similar to what we did with DARPA with the DoD as well, in that you're able to bring in the brightest, the most eccentric, the most like, like the folks who think outside the box and say like, well, what if we used, XYZ to cure this and everything like that? And BARDA would have the funding to do so and bring these proof of concepts to reality. And that's the sole purpose behind it. And it's actually one of the many things I'm glad that we have established here. And I really wish we would pump more money into it, really, equal to that of like DARPA or IARPA or any of those organizations that do a lot of the intelligence and defense-based research. And I hope that we do something here with BARDA in many aspects, so that something like you guys say, where we do have a lot of really cool concepts and really like wonderful like ideas that they don't languish in like the bureaucratic process within the federal government. Now, what is lacking, and it's something that we're working on, my team and different groups, is so once you demonstrate a proof of concept, how do we make sure that we bring that to, one, actionable policy, and two, deliverable for the American people, right? So there are different like, cancer treatments that are being proposed. There are different like long-term, chronic fatigue syndrome, like things that we're looking at along with long COVID. And there are different projects that are being led in there right now that we're trying to say like, okay, well, let's say something like this does work. Let's make sure that it doesn't happen like Paxlovid, where just like people are still not figuring out what the hell Paxlovid is, and ensure that the American public has access to it, that they don't have to pay a dime out of their pocket, and that it is accessible as much as possible to everyone, and that we do a better job of communicating that. The pandemic really taught us a lot in terms of like how we have delivered a lot of those aspects. And even now to this day, like I still have to tell people who are immunocompromised, I'm like, EV Shield is like a legitimate thing you should be taking as a pre-exposure prophylaxis, because we don't do a good job of like communicating that. I think part of it too is that like a lot of people have lost faith in, the HHS and CDC and communicating that. So they go through different avenues. And it's why you have Homozygo, you have me and other folks who are on here who are on Twitter, like spouting, like, I'm like, it's the reason why I don't want to get verified. I don't want to have my CDC name on there, because I'm still able to confer trust in people on the platform, because I'm going to be honest and I'm still going to be critical of my own organization. And I'm going to tell you that there are certain things that should be accessible to you, what you should be doing, what you should be looking for, and watching out for certain things without having to worry about any of the repercussions. So there's a lot that's left to be said, but it'll get there, but it's not going to be as fast. And also it depends on like how we're seeing with the next administration, right? Like if a next administration is very anti-science and they somehow come in, might not be there. It might not be something we can do much there. So it's a little bit of a gamble, but I would still stay there regardless and try to ensure that we do the best that we can with whatever political resource that we have.
All right. I think on on that note, I'll kind of turn it to the rest of the panelists because chat has like a million questions for Dr. Neuro, which is awesome. But I want to give the panelists at least the first opportunity to pick Dr. Neuro's brain anymore if they would like to do so.
Go for it. I already asked a bunch.
Well, I was kind of looking at the last couple chats in about any kind of, I guess, collectivization within the actual organization structure in the form of unions. I don't know if you're looking at chat, like democratization. Like, is there any existence of that? And is there any sentiment towards it, if not?
Not really, because this is the problem again. You have old guards that are on there that they're still stovepipes within organizations, and they like to keep it that way. There's a lot of I'll say this because I actually got told this at one meeting, and I legit started cackling, and I was not on mute. But someone literally told me I couldn't look at certain data sets because of data sovereignty. In my own organization.
What does that mean? So that you're being gate kept from looking at information?
Yeah.
Why? What's the just
Their
separate
reason is why do you need to see it? What's the reason?
Was like stand your ground for data? What?
Wait, I mean, couldn't you FOIA it?
Yeah, these data cannot be detained, Greg.
It's a public.
It's not like I can do an internal FOIA or anything.
But it couldn't like I don't know if it, let's say it leaked or something that data existed. Couldn't like a journalist ask for a FOIA?
It could, yeah.
Freedom of Information Act request.
Not necessarily like a confidentiality. It's just like some people are that petty and will say like, "Oh, this is my work and my data. What are you going to do with this? Are you going to publish it on your division's behalf or your?" I'm like,
God,
no, I just want to fucking know what this is.
That's even worse than I thought. That's even worse.
That still exists in several parts of like a lot of agencies, and it's gotten better. I will say, like at the beginning, it was like State Department was pretty bad. I will say in many aspects because I will ask about like certain countries, like with their, health security stuff and everything like that, and they would legit look at me and they're like, "Well, why would you need to know?" I'm like, "Because I'm actually superior, like in rank to you, so you need to fucking give it to me."
Isn't this the whole point of DHS, the biggest expansion of the federal government that's ever existed since the creation of the federal government? The whole idea, create the DHS as this umbrella organization that links all these things together in order to facilitate the sharing of information?
If you can point me to those links, that would be
God
great.
damn it!
I don't see
Damn it!
That's always one thing about like working in a lab and getting into
Oh
science
my
that I realized
gosh.
that no one ever told me. Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can hear.
No one ever like told me is how not open to sharing scientists are. Like,
Yeah.
no, you can't touch that stuff. Our lab bought that. That's ours. Or like, if you give any sort of contribution, like you're getting my name on that paper, right? Like, or, make sure you publish it under our agency and whatever. Like, they're very
Bunch of clout
all we have is
demons.
our clout. All we have is our clout. So we have to chase it, I guess. But yeah,
and these are like
a lot of I didn't know before I got into it.
It's a lot of artifacts of a lot of kind of the archaic structure of how academia and like these old scientists work, right? They worry about like their work. Here's the thing, and this is something I've been pushing very much so in many aspects, is that science has become much more interdisciplinary, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's impossible. Like the work that I do, I require the consultants from veterinary medicine, other epidemiologists, sociologists, psychologists, different groups in all different fields to ensure that we get a complete picture for a lot of the work that we're doing. A lot of people who kind of lead these organizations, they're very reticent about bringing in other people because it kind of ruins their idea and paradigm of how science works. But there are people, I will say, like I said, who are okay with it and are embracing that type of like paradigm change. And it's slowly filtering out, but it's just a very slow process to get a lot of these folks out. And it's happening, but like I said, glacial pace. And if you're hoping to come in and make a revolutionary change to how we do policy or how we do science policy, you're going to be in for a very rude shock. But the thing is that the work does need to be done. Like, it can't just sit there and languish. So we, as in, my group and a couple of others and different agencies, like, we're okay with like data sharing. We're okay with looking at problem sets together and figuring out how can we tackle this as as scientists, not as different agency representatives, right? That's something that, it's never been embraced before previously in other past generations of like scientific organization, the federal scientific organizations. And it's a slow changing process, but it requires like people, and I'm not saying like I'm not young by any means, but like a lot of times I come in and like I am the youngest person in the room, and I have to be the voice that says like we need to start thinking outside the box and stop thinking of ourselves as a savior complex in many of these like work that we're doing. And you do get people who will agree with you. And it's identifying those allies and really figuring out how best you can get them to work together with a working group, draft up ways to address this, and bring like white papers forward and say like, here's the value added if we were to do this approach. And a lot of people are like, well, that sounds like a roundabout. It is kind of a roundabout way, but that's just, this is politics, unfortunately, in many aspects. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but like we are never going to get to a point where the agility of science is going to match the deliberateness of like how we do policy development. So
yeah. So in the midst of that answer, you actually said something kind of interesting that goes back to the question that Grandma pulled out of chat. You made the point that ultimately, like, the work still needs to be done, and at the end of the day, like, that labor is still intellectual labor. It's not necessarily blue collar, but it's labor nonetheless.
correct.
So as to that notion of like democratization, if the agencies exist in a manner that's like so cripplingly non-functional, I would almost hypothesize. If you were to see something like, CDC employees form labor union, go on strike because they're severely underfunded or something like that would create such a massive uproar that you would actually, potentially radicalize a lot of the public to your cause.
Dude, the Senate staffers this week. Senate staffers go on a strike in the Senate, and then Manchin changed his mind later that week.
Yeah, I think staffers are not going to be the same as CDC employees.
Right. One group of people has a much more impactful labor to do than the other. And
which
Amber,
one is more important? What do you mean there?
Especially with how many people are chomping at the bit to get a CDC position.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the thing, right? Like, that's the whole notion of going on strike. You can't replace everybody. You can't fire everybody. The CDC is already sort of in a non-functional state, and if you have the rank and file basically pointing the finger at like the executive branch, especially if it's like a Trump administration executive branch being like, okay, these demons are the ones responsible for our agency not functioning very well, that would have some value. I think the USDA tried to do something when the Trump administration was trying to forcibly, no, not forcibly, they were trying to get climate scientists to either relocate from DC to Kansas City, Missouri, or lose their job. Mm-hmm. And they actually tried to form a labor union, and they did. It was too late. The ratification of their union occurred after the deadline for relocation. But at the very least, like, that was the first time I saw like government employees or government scientists actually turn to unionization as a response, as a strategy to protect what they're doing. So, at least in my opinion, it might be an underutilized strategy that maybe people in government just don't know is a thing they could do.
Well, then, so like if we were to do this for CDC's purposes, right? So what would be when you look at how the USDA situation, and I remember that very well, was that it was a push against the executive branch to do a very nonsensical policy push. But for CDC's purposes here, like, what would be the end goal for us? What would you want to see happen from a union group? It's a legitimate question. So
Well, that would be up to obviously like the rank and file of the CDC. I mean, it was really that's the whole point of a union is you identify your needs and then you withhold your labor to actually get them.
Let's
So
use the
yeah,
let's use the example of the cruise ships. Like the CDC employees got overruled by DHS there. I mean, could the CDC have like strike?
well, I mean that seems like a very difficult problem because that's probably going to require like legislation to actually give the CDC the proper legal authorities to act in not only that situation but in a
They
variety
did.
of others.
They were the ones that actually had the. I thought, Dr. Neuro, please correct me if I'm wrong here. I thought that they were the ones that had the power there in that scenario, and then the DHS from the executive branch overruled them and said that no, you guys we're doing this instead. I thought that they did have it.
Yeah, they did on a technicality, because then it becomes like this is where health security becomes a very tenuous ground in many aspects, right? Because where we consider where CDC authorities lie in terms of like how we address certain health risks to the United States soil can easily be yoinked by other agencies because they believe that it is within their legal authority to address it. And that's what happened with the cruise situation, was that they saw it as a threat to domestic soil and gave prudence for them, and it gave them grounds to essentially do what they were supposed to do and enact upon that. And this is, again, like part of the challenge of this is like really addressing how CDC needs to relook at its authorities and really update it, because our authorities are kind of shit. It's really bad. And it's just because, again, we're facing a novel pathogen in a novel pandemic that we have never faced before, and a lot of our policies and a lot of our like authorities were based upon a lot of like kind of like local epidemics and outbreaks or isolated incidences, but nothing to the point where it's like a global pandemic, right? We've never had a global pandemic like this, so it's challenged a lot of like how we look at authorities. And part of the reason our group is focusing really on is like looking at how do we update this and how do we ensure that if something like this, God forbid, I hope it doesn't, but if it does happen again, we need to ensure that CDC does have the authorities and ground and the blessing of the executive branch to do the shit that we're supposed to do.
So I think it was you that tweeted this about like the US government having preparations for things like monkeypox, but not wanting to use them because it's not exactly what it was intended. Like, I don't remember if it was you or somebody else on Twitter, but they were talking about how like the US government prepared for smallpox bioweapon like shit.
Yeah,
but
I think it was a
they
retweet
don't
of
want to
Joseph
use
Osmond.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. They don't want to use it for monkeypox because it's not bad enough, or it's not what they designated it for, or something along those lines.
I mean, so the national stockpiles of that vaccine and treatment was intended for in the case that we felt that it was an actual biological attack on national soil. Mm-hmm. Or if you felt it was like something of a catastrophic event that could impend upon a smallpox outbreak. When monkeypox landed, it landed with a very soft thud, like in terms of that. Not because of anything, it's just because we weren't really looking that hard. We were kind of going through a pandemic like COVID still. Yes, it's still happening. And it really put this unfortunate stance. And also, unfortunately, like we focused so much on the fact that it was only concentrated on one key population, like MSM, which is men who have sex with men, population, that it made to be like, it was just one of those things that's like, oh, we can take care of it. It's not a big deal. Let's just take a little bit here and there. But, I talked with Dr. Tatanji and a couple of other ID docs who do kind of this work. And we were all like, no, we actually need to start like now.
You think we would have learned this from like the AIDS epidemic or COVID or...
and this is like
but it's hard to tell, because then you get things like swine flu that people freak out about that don't really like have this widespread impact as much as we think they're going to. So,
and you just raised a wonderful point right there, in that like not all epidemics are created equal. And unfortunately, it's this like very weird game of like, can you predict if epidemics are going to get out of control or if they are not? And I will say with monkeypox, what made this outbreak so specifically like weird in many aspects was just how quickly it spread globally, with outside of the normal ways that we normally understood it, because we didn't really understood monkeypox, outside the context of local African outbreaks, that it really challenged a lot of like what we were doing. And no excuse. Like we should have honestly like realized that something was wrong, and that we should have like already engaged with Bardic, Bardic Novartis to like start pumping up a lot of it. And we started that discussion, but it was like by the time we started having those discussions, like cases were already skyrocketing worldwide, and WHO finally declared public health emergency like of international concern. And then like now the White House is like, oh hey, this is an emergency. And I'm like, well, we can still do stuff without the WHO signing off as an emergency. So it's a very challenging aspect. And even today, like I just tweeted this out, like not a single one of those vaccines, by the way, has landed in African soil, despite the fact that Africa has been combating monkeypox for decades before it even landed on US soil. Not a single dose has landed on their country, like on the continent. And
that's disgusting.
It's disgusting and it's terrible. And I will tell you right now, I've talked to many people at the African CDC, and they will tell you the same story, that we have begged the international community to address monkeypox for a long time. They have. But because it hasn't landed on developed soil, it hasn't touched, I'll put it this way, it didn't kill a white person in a different country.
Yeah, ignoring the global south has consequences.
Yeah, who would have thought?
Everybody's a jurisprudence fetishist until it hits American soil.
And this is the unfortunate factor with like something like monkeypox too, is that it luckily so far has a very low fatality rate. So unfortunately, when you talk to certain people about pandemics or diseases, a lot of them are just like, well, it hasn't killed anyone yet, so why do we need to be concerned about it? I'm like,
there are a lot of things that happen before you die.
Well, and like I'm like, it's lucky right now we have a lot of people who are impacted, healthy individuals, but I was like, once it spills out, I was like, you do have other vulnerable populations that exist out there. Like, we have right now some kids have already been impacted, some women, and we have woman to child transmission that has happened already, noted transmission. God forbid if that spills out to a largely immunocompromised population, what do we do then? So
I think
I don't.
Go ahead.
Oh, I don't want to direct the conversation too much away from monkeypox, but we were talking today in chat about long COVID and how this is part of a conversation, at least within mainstream media, that is just non-existent. So on the CDC side, is there any effort to communicate like long-term effects of COVID or any kind of treatment? Like what's it look like on that end?
So I sit on that committee right now. So we are pushing very aggressively to get that as part. I mean, there's like reason why there's like language on the website now about it, and that was our group to ensure that we talk about the visibility of long COVID, the trickiness of long COVID. And this is where it gets very hairy in terms of like when we start talking clinically and we start talking from a public health perspective, is that it manifests in such broad terms that how you're supposed to advise clinicians and things like that, how to address it, it's hard because it's like anything from fatigue to neurological impairment, that whole spectrum can be considered under long COVID because we still don't really understand the true mechanisms and pathogenesis of like what leads to long COVID, right? So that's the first challenge. And the second one is like, if you don't understand the cause, how do you treat it? And so we are right now throwing everything we can in arsenal aspects of it. We have pushed Pfizer to look at Paxlovid trials to look at them treating long COVID patients. can we look at other antiretroviral treatments to look at long COVID aspects, and how do we address that? And not every treatment is going to address every single symptom of long COVID, right? Because it can impact anything from GI, gastrointestinal, all the way up to the brain. And we have to really think like creatively, and like how do we expand that? One of the initiatives we're pushing for really is starting up not just like immediate like pandemic response, but also looking at post sequelae or any like post infection syndrome initiative research groups, to ensure that, and this, by the way, COVID is not the only one that causes like long-term effects. There's a lot of other diseases out there that actually do this. And we're trying to push that there is research that ensures that there is support and that there is work that exists beyond that of acute infection or hospitalizations or death, because it's not necessarily just that, right? We've learned the hard way that COVID can impact a very small population, though it's not insignificant, of post-sequelae symptoms. And it's important we continue having those dialogues. And it's always like the forefront of like a lot of my discussion points when I talk with every of the leadership too.
Well, and I think, Graham, you could probably add on to that. I always like to compare and contrast between the UK and the US. In the UK, they have legally recognized long COVID as a disability. And that wasn't because their government actually decided to, but it was because somebody was actually suing because they were allegedly wrongfully terminated from their job because they got COVID and subsequently long COVID. So they said, well, now you're discriminating against people who have long COVID, and that's functionally a disability. So you're basically being ableist by firing me from this job.
Right.
So
well, you know a couple of the people within my community that are on disability with long COVID. So being like the political person within the group here, I'm immediately thinking starving the beast, welfare queens. These are the kinds of things that are going to be, justifications for pushback against, giving people disability for long COVID. So I guess to your point, Neuro, the clarity of what exactly does this look like? What are the qualifiers? What are the treatments? How do we know exactly what, data pool is affected by this? So, that was kind of where I was drawing that from. So I can communicate that back to some of the people in my community.
Well, what's really annoying on that note too is there's a bunch of discourse, and I think Neuro, you probably might have seen some of this. One prominent epidemiologist who's otherwise really good, Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz, he's been basically long COVID tweeting for like the past day or two, being like, "Well, actually, if we use a different definition of long COVID, it's actually a lot fewer people, and therefore I'm really not super inclined to like worry about it." But then everybody who has long COVID's like, "Dude, what the fuck? Yeah. You're just conveniently choosing the definition that like fits that point. Like, you're better than this. You of all people who's been calling out flawed ivermectin research for fucking with stats is now like making weird social arguments by fucking with stats."
Yeah,
it's amazing.
And I think this is the challenge when we start looking at clinical like presentations of things such as long COVID and addressing it as a scientific community, is that like from certain epidemiologists, and I did remember seeing that, and there was intense discussion within like a lot of like the chat groups I'm in, where we argued about how we looked at long COVID. And I think in general, like my argument back to him was that we cannot have that definition set right there, because it unfortunately stifles development of therapeutics and stifles development of policies effective to support people who are coming out of COVID, because we still do not understand the true mechanism behind it. If we understood the mechanism about it, then maybe a bit different story, but we still don't understand that. So epidemiologists, not all epidemiologists are clinicians, and not all clinicians are epidemiologists. So or even like researchers in this fact, or people who understand it. And I'll tell you right now that Akiko Iwasaki and a couple of other people who are big proponents of like long COVID research will tell you right now that the definition is always changing. The definition is broad for a reason, because of the fact that until we have a true understanding of it, and it could even be system specific too, right? Like we could look at different pathogenesis within the GI, different pathogenesis within the central nervous system, whatever it might be. We can't say for sure until we get a firm grasp of that. So he could postulate all he wants about the definition, but in the end, the reality is that someone who does suffer from long COVID after a mild or an acute infection, that challenge is still a reality and it's still there. And I'm certainly not going to deny that. So
I figured that was something that was kind of learned from COVID, is that science is never like 100% certain. And we make up these definitions as we go. Like, this is not set in stone. We did not get the tablet from Moses to tell us what long COVID looks like. So
is the idea,
I'm still astounded that people like take it as gospel as soon as it comes out of a scientist's mouth.
Is the skeptics view of this? I'm not read up on what their view is the skeptics view that it's just like a neurological thing where it's not really, or a psychological thing versus like a physical condition. Is that what they're trying to argue? That they're just, people are bummed that it's it's a pandemic still?
Oh, I'm sure there's plenty of people saying it's psychosomatic.
Well, I mean, there's and the psychosomatic camp is one of them. Unfortunately, that argument came from the NIH. Their first long COVID study that came out was very poorly done methodologically, and it was like, okay, we took a bunch of people who were worried they had long COVID and found out if they actually had it, and they didn't. Therefore, it's all just anxiety. Actually, long COVID isn't real.
Okay. Oh my gosh!
No, and
That's weird.
and it's very unfortunate in that aspect, and I think that. I will say personally for myself, I don't stand by that school of thought. I take it very seriously. I take it, I always make sure that voice is heard in many aspects. And I do get long haulers who message me on the daily, sharing their stories and asking me how they can help. And, I think one of the many things that, and, a big step we took was redefining one of the ICD codes in the hospital to really say hey, if they have long COVID, here's a code for it now. There's an actual code for it. But this challenge, by the way, of a chronic syndrome after an acute infection has existed way before COVID too. This is something I tell people that no one's ever heard of, it's chronic fatigue syndrome. A lot of people actually suffered through many of that before COVID came along. And it took a lot. And you could tell that poor group was literally screaming on top of their lungs when long COVID started coming out. And they're like, this is the problem we've been yelling about for decades. And no one took it seriously and no one's done research into it. But now, because of the precedence of the pandemic, we started being much more, tuned into the fact that, again, after the acute phase of an infection happens, the struggle might not end there for many people. And we need to make sure that support is existent there beyond that of, your typical standpoint. And I still, to this day, remember the story of a mother who messaged me on Twitter saying that her kid, 16 years old, brilliant and everything, straight A's, got COVID, mild symptoms, has trouble remembering lessons from the day before, and has grown suicidal and is depressed every day because he cannot intake lessons the day before, and he's failing all his subjects. And she didn't know what to do. And I didn't have an answer for that because I was I don't know how to address it because I don't even understand the problem, man. But it's situations like that that make me really sad that we don't take long COVID seriously. And it's why I hate when people say it's a small number. I'm it might be a small number of people, but that small number of people are still, there's still people who you need to treat, right? And we can't ignore them.
I mean, that was the same argument they used with the COVID deaths. It was it's a small, it's 2%, 1%. It's but that's 1 million people that are dead now.
Yeah. Thousands of people still going through day to day and can't work because they can't perform the normal task because they get physically exhausted, or just cannot mentally process the information they were used to. And I can tell you right now, and I argued with this person one time, I was just do you really think someone would want to bankrupt themselves to push for long COVID symptoms? Do you think someone's actually going to make sure that they go on disability for the pure sake of proving a point that they have long COVID? it's wild to me in many aspects about how we look at it.
I thought, I mean, the studies that are coming out are showing that it's actually way higher than we had previously thought. Chen, 2022, in the Journal of Infectious Diseases, Global Prevalence of Post-COVID-19 Condition, or Long COVID, a meta-analysis. The results. Global estimated pooled prevalence of post-COVID-19 condition was 0.43. So 43% of people. I mean, it's like, it's high. It's way higher than people think.
Yeah. And think about it from that perspective that not every single country has that resources available to support folks like that.
Or to even find them in the first place.
Or to even find them in the first place. I worry in many aspects that and it's like pretty much when we first started talking about it, I still stress the fact that it is the second head of the Hydra that is COVID that we are ignoring. And until we address that, we're always going to have resources that are going to be highly underutilized, and we are going to be leaving a lot of people out in the dust of support. So it's not the most fuzzy feeling you'll get. But to your point, Gremlo, I'm pushing, and there's a lot of people in CDC who are pushing for better long COVID visibility in research and support beyond there, right? Because it's not just therapeutics and things like it's ensuring that people who might not have access to those therapeutics are financially supported, and like many aspects, psychosocial support as well, ensure that they are not stigmatized and that they can claim disability, that they can continue to do the work while not feeling like not protected in United States. And it's a slow process, and we're trying to push through many aspects of that.
Is CDC, at least in like the PR division, trying to communicate that to the public right now?
No.
Yeah.
No, and that's part of that challenge, right? I mentioned that earlier.
Right.
We don't talk about the successes and all the different things we're doing.
That is one thing that does seem to have frustrated everyone in the last 2 years, is that we kind of feel like we're left out in the dark. Like
that was my biggest
communication. I think we opened up this episode today talking about efficient science communicators. Mm-hmm. It is endlessly frustrating. At least like when I watch Marcus's stream, and he talks about looks at a broadcast where someone's trying to explain to the public what is going on, what they need to know, and they cannot put it into terms that the public can understand. They're constantly stuck within like the ivory tower, intelligentsia speak.
Or they dumb it down too much, and then the people don't either get all the information, or they know they're being talked down to. Like that was my biggest gripe throughout the whole pandemic, was if you found sources, it was either extremely dumbed down or it was research paper. And there was no in between for that, like basic adult communication about COVID.
And I think a lot of these things are very warranted and very much elucidates a very problematic culture within scientific organizations of science communication, right? Like the way that our CDC's PR organization functions is like pretty much like, and I feel so bad for the communications and PR group because they don't do much of the creative stuff, by the way. They basically, what ends up happening is that they're the group that just gets the information. All they do is make sure that it's Section 508, which is readability and everything, compliant, make sure that things are okay, and then publish it. They don't really check for like, would it make sense to the public? Does it like jive with like what we're saying here? Like things such as like as simple as, and something I've been asking for, I was just like, we need to look at an analysis of our website, see how many people who go through our websites, how many clicks does it take to get to the important information?
It's bad, dude. It's real bad.
It's very bad. I can't tell you how many times people have messaged me on Twitter and they're saying, I don't fucking know what boosters I should get.
Mm-hmm.
And there are whole add-ons you can get for web development that show you a map, like a literal heat map of your web page that shows where people's, clicks are, that you can track these things with.
My biggest problem with it was like when things would be changing really quickly, or there'd be a new thing to come out. There's no like change log. It's just like, this is it. And you're like, what's the new one? Like, and it's hard to tell people like, well, okay, this is different now. This is what it was before. This is what it is now. I can understand trying to put like, go ahead.
I feel like the problem with leaving that information available,
bad information out there.
Yeah. People who, you know,
I think
aren't
that's
good
valid.
faith actors or aren't like at all familiar with the scientific process. They're just going to see that and be like, what are they covering up if they're changing all this shit all the time?
Mm-hmm.
But this is where science communication and transparency really shine right there, right? This is our opportunity to say like, hey, we did change this. Yes, absolutely correct. But here's our justification for this. Here's the analysis and data we
that
looked
would be great.
at.
That's the good part about science. That's the good part.
We don't do that. This is the problem. We don't do that at all. And people, and like things like such as the justification, which wasn't really a justification, like when we kept changing our mask guidance or when we kept changing our like community risk indices, like when I went to an internal briefing of CDC to talk about the community risk indices, it was literally just like, oh, it is because it's just so much easier to read. And I'm like, but it doesn't make sense. Where are we taking account X, Y, and Z? And they're just like, well, the American public should be able to figure it out. I'm like, they did it.
No.
But
do the average reading level is like 7th grade. Come on.
Even if they, I mean, who's going to put in the work?
Yeah.
Yep. And I think it's a very unfortunate stance where we underestimate and we overestimate the American public in many aspects. And part of that challenge again comes down to we need effective science communicators doing a lot of the work of communicating the work that we're doing, and we don't have that, right? Like we certainly don't at all. And again, I can tell you right now, there's several things I've said tonight. I know people are just like, oh, I didn't even know CDC did that, or I didn't know CDC like spearheaded this initiative. And it's because we don't do a good job of communicating any of this crap at all. We just kind of like operate our own little world, and we say like, everyone loves us and we're going to be fixing the world. And when the rest of the world is like, pointing spears at us. And, I'm still a proud CDC employee. I'm not going to try to say like I'm not, but I'm not going to sit here and deny that there's a lot of problems with it, like a lot of problems. But these problems existed, and I said this in the last talk, these problems existed way before Trump even came in. Because we operated as like this own little kind of like scientific sphere that didn't have to worry about a lot of these issues. And now our paradigm is challenged, and we're kind of like, looking around with the deer in the headlights, just figuring out what the heck we need to do. And part of that just comes with like the whole paralysis territory that we don't know where we need to go next. And, I can only advise so much and I can only do so much. It's not like I can just waltz up to Walensky and just be like, hey girl, listen, we gotta do this. Okay. One should be like, who the hell are you?
Do you, is there like a rogues gallery for the CDC where you have like a handful of people that the CDC is constantly like, oh my God, if I could just get my hands on these people, they're fucking it up for everybody? Or is the call coming from within the house?
There's a rogues gallery.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pray tell, or is that
there's dozens of us, dozens.
Dozens.
Okay.
Yeah. That's all I'll say.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
But I mean, also it when I talk about this too, like not to get into, because I saw someone mention in chat as well, it stems from a lot more of a systemic public like dysfunction too, in that like, we have a education deficit, we have a academic deficit, we have a lot of problems within the United States that has profligated a lot of anti-science and intelligent rhetoric, like in a lot of ways. And people would easily like to blame Twitter and everything like that. I'm like, no, I think that this existed before Twitter came into play, and Twitter just amplified it. And
well, that's one of the warning signs of fascism, is like anti-intellectualism and stuff like that. So I don't think that's new.
Yep.
At all.
It isn't.
But
it isn't. So we we have time to, we still have a chance to like turn a lot of this around, but unfortunately, like, we don't, we're losing ground. And, I worry as to like where we're going to be going next steps wise. But until then, like the best you can do, we were doing the initial UN goal of 90-90-90, which is 90% virally suppressed, 90% of people who tested who know that they're positive, and 90% of people who continue to be on on treatment and aspects like that. Many other countries have approached that. We're aggressively approaching it. It's actually one of the hallmark successes of global health. We're doing well. We're doing well in there, but COVID really fucked up a lot of other things too, because, statistics came out last year where our tuberculosis numbers were higher than normal because people weren't able to get treatment for it because hospital wards were so overfilled with COVID patients that they weren't able to get isoniazid treatment for TB. So it's a give or take, but I will say that another like hopium aspects of this is that a lot of the scientific community has realized the value of science communication, and has there's a lot more initiatives pushed forward by different groups to ensure that future scientists are coming in to not only do the research work, but also communicating that. So I think that that's one of the big ones. The third one as well is that there's a lot more, and it doesn't seem like it, but there's a lot more international work that's being done in a collaborative manner to ensure that new inventions are being pushed forward, or innovative like treatments are being pushed forward. Now, whether that gets to the right countries is a different story, but the fact that we have something like Operation Warp Speed, or like the first initial mRNA vaccines pushed through, is nothing short of like an actual miracle that never should have happened. That would have never happened on any other normal circumstances. And one of the many things too is that now, even within the federal space right now, for example, we have earmarked significantly more portions of money than we used to. It's not much, but it's still a sign that the paradigm is slowly changing, that, hey, like health security is very much a big threat to all developed nations, and that we need to address this like right now. Otherwise, we'll get to a point where we will not have the capacity to do that. And even like within the health communities right now as well, we are bringing in, we're taking a much more serious look at like how much new talent we're bringing into hospitals, like new doctors and new nurses, and seeing like where are some of the gaps and everything, because the pandemic really taught us that frontline workers were overwhelmed during the initial parts of it, and they were not supported towards the end. None of the hospitals supported them. We were constantly harassed and all this other stuff. It took a lot for us to kind of re-look at a lot of how we did business and figure out where do we need to bring in a lot of new talent. And I hope that within the next decade, because it's not going to go away within the year or so, within the next decade, that it will right itself in many aspects for science, for a lot of the kind of the community, but it's going to take time, but at least it's moving. It's not at a standstill, and unfortunately, you're not going to hear about it because, like I said, glacial pace. So it's a hopium, but it's not the hopium that you were hoping for.
Man, the new nanotechnology based vaccines look awesome too. I mean, the lipid nanoparticles that we use right now, that's 33-year-old nanotechnology. I mean, the new ones think about like a golf ball with all those divots with different types of vaccine kind of things that you can learn, your body can learn, mucosal vaccines. It's there's a lot of really cool technology that's coming out right now. So.
And we're pushing to ensure that we are being better about investing in that type of work, right? We're ensuring that the U.S. taxpayers are going to not just what's the next super missile that we can, or new I don't know how many jets that they have. Are they F-15, F-17? I don't know. But
which ones have they canceled recently? The F-35?
We, instead of focusing on the next $7 million jet that's just going to sit on a fucking yard, excuse my language, we're focusing on the next generation of cancer treatment. We're focusing on the next generation of therapeutics. And what COVID really taught us is that, hey, guess what? If you pump a shit ton of money on a problem, it can be resolved and we can find solutions for it. And I hope that the White House summit that we had recently really kind of spurred a lot of those discussions. But I don't know if we're going to get to that same level of money that we got within Operation Warp Speed, but we sure as hell should be looking at finding creative solutions and pumping as much money as we can to looking at them, so that we're not sitting here being like, okay, well, it's going to take 5 years to review the data and get this stuff, and then maybe we'll take a look at it. And I'm like, no, because at that point, it's just going to, people will forget it and it's just going to languish. So we need to speed things up a lot more.
All right, so I think on that note, this would probably be a halfway decent time to turn to some of the chat questions, because they have been numerous, and I know we've tried to incorporate them as time has gone on, but I think we have received a lot more questions than we were able to kind of work into the discussion.
Happy to answer.
So I think K-Pars asked a really good question, insofar as just, how maybe this is your personal philosophy, and you could, juxtapose this with how the CDC operates, but how do you balance scientific expertise with democratic mandate?
You don't, but that's not necessarily not to say that I don't. What you focus on is what the goal of your research is and how does it always align to the objectives that's set forth by the administration in the end, regardless of the mandate or whatever it might be. A good federal scientist can do that. No matter what mandate or whatever comes down the line, we can always find a way to do it. Even in the context of, let's say, like that whole fiasco of abstinence-only education, we found creative ways to ensure that even though we earmarked 10% of our funding towards abstinence-only education, we said that we went back and said, look, we earmarked 10% of that funding towards abstinence-only education, but that also goes towards educational facilities that provide access to condoms. You wheedle around it, right? And you figure out ways to talk about it in a way that still addresses it's like kind of sidestepping the actual like problem and being like, here's an alternative solution that we can add that's parallel to it. Even though this is a problematic solution, it's my way of compromising in between. And that's unfortunately the only way, but it gets things done and still ensures that you're able to do the effective programming that you were originally set out to do.
Kind of working within the system that you're given.
And I'll tell you right now, a lot of people don't know how to do that because you're taught in such a rigorous way in academia that, you need to do X, Y, Z. And if you don't do it in this order, your whole PhD thesis goes down the shithole or your project goes down the crap. And it's like, in here, like, it's very much like, how do you work within the system and how do you get creative within the kind of like the rule set of that agency.
All right, that makes good sense. I think the next question that I fielded, where did I put it? Okay, here we go. Are the sort of like, I don't want to call them like rank and file, but generally speaking, in your experience, are government servants, especially within science, are they more like pragmatic, less concerned about like political optics? Are they able to just kind of focus on the job and do it, or do they have some of those the Biden administration wants all of you to sort of say and continue to repeat these talking points, so please incorporate that into your workflow type of deal? Like, I guess how much how much of a political component comes into their jobs insofar as actually trying to do it?
It depends on who's speaking, depends on who the audience is, and depends on what the goal is going to be accomplished. Those are the three things. There's always going to be some sort of politics involved in it, but I will say within a lot of the scientific organizations that there is less of a rank file structure in that aspect. It's like, well, I am a GS-15, you're just a 13, shut up. Like, there's none of that. you do see that with DoD a lot. There's a lot of folks in DoD. They're just like, I'm Corporal General and blah blah blah, and you're like, what? But with even in the State Department, it was kind of like, if like for example, like if I were to walk into a State Department meeting, people have to stand up
Ooh, they do attention on deck for you?
because I'm an SES.
I feel
but they
good,
don't
to be
have-
honest.
It does kind of feel good.
Okay.
But I don't get that CDC. When I walk in, people still sit, and I'm like, in my head, I'm just like, fucking stand up. No. But I think like in general, like, even in like state, people do that, but it's more of like, but it's not like, oh my God, like you have to. And there is that even like in State Department, like you have assistant deputy secretaries and blah, blah, blah. Like you do have to make sure that there is some sort of decor that you do exercise from that. But in terms of like talking points and things like that, again, like it depends on who you're talking to, it depends on who's speaking and what the goal is, right? Like if I was talking to OMB, for example, I would have to put on a different hat, and they say like basically spit out the talking points of the administration needs, because that's what they're operating to do, is to ensure that every funding that's being allocated in every agency is addressing the president's stuff, whatever it might be. And for me, I have to make sure that my like viewpoint is shifted so that I can address to find a narrative that fits within that person, so I can ensure success that my agency and my group gets funding. But if I'm talking to fellow scientific agencies, like if I were to do CDC to FDA, different story, right? Like I'm not having to stress out about that. I can focus on the fact that my goal is to build a bridge with FDA and CDC and say like, hey, we're looking at long COVID treatment. We're looking at this. What can we do better to, facilitate this, like barring like any sort of mandate, whatever it might be. I'm like, well, let's make sure that the placeholders are there. And you'll find that a lot of groups are willing to have those discussions. It's just that a lot of times, it's kind of like that weird dating. And like, yeah, it's like, do you ask the girl out, or do you wait for the girl to ask you out? And it's just like this weird dance back and forth. And for me, I'm just like, I don't care. I'm just going to waltz up to the person and say like, yeah, you want to do this or not? It's a little bit of a weird dance from that, but that's kind of my, like a long way to answer that question, hopefully.
All right, that was another, I think, pretty thorough answer. Another question, which I think is also going to elicit another thorough answer, is, I guess, like, what is really the deal with like current CDC communiques insofar as like masks and the necessity for them, additional vaccines is concerned? And I'll kind of like tack on to that. We're just finding out via a New York Times article that was posted in chat that we're getting Omicron-specific vaccines like starting to roll out in September. From Pfizer and Moderna, but it's like I found that out through the New York Times in my Twitch chat, not from like the CDC, giving me like a Twitter push notification being like, hey asshole, go get a vaccine. Like it wasn't coming from the top down, it was coming from like journalists. So like what is the state of affairs as far as CDC communications?
Well, so it's a very like layered question, because if we talk about the masking situation, that was unfortunately very politically driven. There was not much wiggle room in terms of us talking about it, despite the fact that we were like, it doesn't align with the data or the epidemiology of how it's looking at. Same thing situation with like how our community risk map changed, despite the fact that we had been operating under the same metrics for a long time, and somehow we were changing it. And basically that was a lot of political push as well. So both of those can be credited towards that. Not necessarily CDC. Like we basically kind of were strong-armed into it. For the situation like that, what you said right now with the whole September release of the vaccines and things like that, there's a lot of people, me sometimes, that will leak certain dates or things like that. And, we hear a lot of echoes and chats from different groups, or sometimes you'll see it's not necessarily just us, but it could be leaks from Pfizer or Moderna staff themselves that kind of talk about this, like knowing that there is a possibility of a certain release of whatever product that they have. So the leak is kind of all over the place, really, when you talk about things like that, because these are hot button topics, and New York Times knows how to dig right at it. And yeah, I'll just say that right now. There's one leak that actually did happen that I won't even list the article that I was responsible for. So
I mean, it seems like people are leaking less now.
go.
Because it seems like with the Trump administration, it was just constant leaks everywhere out of the administration because there was so many people that were just like, what's going on? It seems, at least like now, it's kind of like more managed, and for good or bad, I don't know.
I mean, and the precedence is different, right? I'm not crediting myself. When Trump was in, a lot of the leaks were there to particularly discredit and to like really shine a much more transparent light on a lot of the tyrannical, I'm not even going to try to sugarcoat that, like tyrannical like auspices of like Trump. But like now within this one, it's more of just the fact that there's a lot of not backroom dealings. There's just a lot of like behind the doors like discussions and like policy decisions that are being made that we don't typically hear. I don't even get to hear certain things until literally someone tells me, and I'm like, well, that's embarrassing. I'm like a senior division lead of this group, and I have never heard of this.
Wow.
And someone from Twitter, like from Jane Doe 5073, is telling me, and I'm like, so we're kind of sucking on that in many aspects. So I'm not even gonna say that we're great on that.
Fair enough. I think we have another question. What can COVID long haulers do in areas where doctors were fighting mandates and pushes for vaccinations? So basically, like, do we just have to like go doctor shopping to find physicians who like recognize long COVID and treat it? And I guess maybe more generally, like, what do you think COVID long haulers can do to advocate for themselves?
So there's a website called Survivor Corps that I'm always a fan of. Let me pull that website up. So I would suggest for anyone is to go through here, identify local organizations, and also like how you can advocate, get your story out. There's a lot of different groups that are out there that are focused on advocacy and also the work. And yes, unfortunately for you, like, if for who asked that question, you might have to do some doctor shopping to see who will take you seriously and will work with you. But I think part of that Survivor Corps is looking at different resources of different people who are in different states to find your resources and things like that. Also looking at different support groups as well to chat with them. There's a lot out there actually that we are trying to do. And one of the initiatives that we're trying to push forward on the CDC's website is to integrate a how can people who long haul symptoms, like what are the resources that they can go beyond that of just, their doctors and things like that. So it's part of formalizing that. But Survivor Corps is probably going to be the first one I always send people to talk about that.
All right. This is more of a meme question, but also kind of not. What do we do if our county commissioner is appointed a QAnon anti-vax chiropractor to our board of health?
Learn how to use a Molotov cocktail.
In Minecraft.
Wasn't expecting that one out of Neuro.
Say, some of us are still trying to get those government jobs.
We just talked about not talking about this, Neuro. Come on,
I'm unhinged. I'm sorry. This is just me being Mimi right now.
It's been 2.5 hours. What do you want?
There's the redacted statement of the episode. We were waiting for
I don't represent the views and everything of CDC. Don't worry.
Yeah, might have to get the editor to apply the big censor beep to your answer there.
No, just add that fast talking dude from like the prescription commercials that goes, side effects may include, but just go, Dr. Neuro's views do not represent the views of the CDC.
Yeah, we might have to add a voice disclaimer over it, like it's a pharmaceutical drug commercial.
You just say what I said on stream earlier today. Sometimes the best message or the best way to get a message to your senator is wrapped around a brick.
Yeah, well, I mean, Martin Luther King literally said something similar in Riots of the Language of the Unheard. So, sometimes it just gets to that point. All right, one more person is asking, they're actually due for their second booster. Is there one vax that is better than the other? And somebody else actually in chat asked, and this is probably like not in the light of the new Omicron specific booster news, but like they were curious as to why the fourth shot was not recommended for everybody and instead just the vulnerable groups.
So I don't agree with that decision. So I'll put that first and foremost right now, given BA4 and 5, even BA2's like prevalence, in the capacity to evade immune response. But I think one of the many things that a lot of folks will argue is return on investment of getting a fourth dose for healthy individuals. And also on the second part, some people will argue the fact that, and these are what I'm speaking on the other side of the aisle here. And some people will say that cases haven't necessitated that just yet. But the pandemic preparedness in me disagrees on many aspects of that, because we know that with every one of these variants, that when they have certain telltale signs of higher immune evasion and higher caseloads, even though there's not much hospitalizations that we need to be prepared for, very much of the fact that a fourth dose must be open to everyone. Part of the gamble, I think, from what we're surmising in our group, is the fact that it might be that they're holding out for recommending the fourth dose of the original formulation until the new formulation comes out, so they can recommend that to everyone. However, here's the problem, is that the current epidemiology speaks to a current high-risk situation to many. And so I always tell people, and if anyone asks me, it's like, should I get it or should I not? And I ask them, what is your current risk looking like right now? Do you live by yourself? Are you in a high community of high transmission? Do you go around and meet a lot of people, or do you just work from home all the time? What are the different factors that factor into your decision matrix before I recommend it, whether if I recommend it or not, or just wait for the next booster? And it's a very personal decision in many aspects beyond there, but it's something that is part of the calculus of how we need to think about boosters from at least until this next generation comes out, or the next iteration comes out with Omicron specific antigens. So I'm hesitant to tell everyone this is a blanket answer for everyone for booster specific, but if you do feel, and I can't dictate it, no one should be able to dictate this for you. If you feel like you are a high risk, go get it. Go get the vaccine. Go get the booster. It doesn't preclude you from getting the new one that comes out. It just means you have to wait a little bit. But go get it right now. Get the protection currently, and you will be fine to get the next iteration of it. It will not siphon you off from there. A lot of people. Sorry, go on.
I was just gonna say, even my parents can get their second booster, and they just have been putting it off because. If everyone else doesn't need it, why would they need it? And the new boosters are coming out, and they want to wait, and they don't think they need it, which is concerning, because they've been really gung-ho about following, wearing their masks everywhere and getting all the vaccines on time up until now. And I'm just concerned about what that means for a wider trend.
And I hear you. And it's something, unfortunately, we are not doing a good job of, and it's actually something that a lot of big scientists on Twitter have been calling CDC out on, is we have not done a good job of communicating the threat that BA5 presents to us. And I think that part of that, and because of that complacency in messaging, a lot of people, like your parents and many other Americans, feel like it's just not something that we have to worry about, right? We're good. We're protected still, right? And maybe you are still protected in many aspects, and you should be good for protection against severe hospitalizations and death. But once again, I don't want to risk infection, period. I don't want to risk that calculus of figuring out how many infections can I get before I keel over. I don't want to answer that question. I don't think we should answer that question. And you have a lot of people out there that legitimately, scientists who do want to answer that question. I'm like, why would you want to answer that question? We should be doing, the best answer is zero, to me. And I know someone had asked, well, what if you're not qualified? If you go, not CDC, personally me, if you go to a pharmacy and just tell them that you're immunocompromised, they will give it to you. They can't check that.
Well, I mean, it's actually funny because I've been mentioning that to some people, and some chatters of mine can actually like report to you that the pharmacists were like fighting back on that. They're like, "Well, tell me all of the intimate details of your immunocompromise," and that led to a variety of different outcomes depending on the chatter.
One that requires you to take prednisone.
Oh, there you go.
I mean, there's so many things. I mean, if people really need help, I can coach people through that. But again, it depends on how high risk you're feeling. And yeah, I've talked to a couple of people about it and talked through with them on how best to approach that problem.
All right, I'm gonna probably call this at the last question from chat because I think everybody's kind of looking a little like wanting to go to sleep, just because we've been on here for almost 3 hours. Where did it go?
Dude, I can't figure out if I have like something going on with my throat or just doing 6 to 7 hour streams every day is starting to like wear down on my my vocal cords.
I mean, it might be probably the latter with hopefully no shades of the former. But you know, you do stream for long blocks. Like you put in some fucking work, man. So you know, rest that voice. Oh god, where was it? Okay, so I think there's one there. Okay, so Lepew asks, are there any people living with disabilities who like work for the CDC to represent that specific group?
Oh, and he's gone.
Yes. One of the chief committee members of us is leads the disability initiatives for CDC and for the American Public Health Association. They sit in the committee that I'm in right now. So there's a couple of people there's a huge group actually that's in CDC and are very vocal. So your voice is being heard. Probably not that obvious, but it is being heard internally within our groups.
Awesome. So I'll at least try to end things before the shoutouts on one sentiment from a chatter. They wanted to thank you, Dr. Neuro, because they say it's refreshing to hear a CDC employee actually speak clearly and directly without sugarcoating. And this gives them more understanding and insight. So just thank you for being you.
Of course. Happy to be here.
All right. I think with that, we could probably go ahead and go around the horn and do shoutouts because we should probably at least wrap things up as far as the broadcast is concerned, because I actually have an unvaxxed documentary from the BBC that I want to watch after this on stream, which is going to be a whole series of laughs and giggles. So with that being said, Greg, you're the first one on my screen, so go ahead.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel called The Peer Review. You can go get there by going to thepeer.review. I like accidentally put out like a stupid amount of content this week. I put like microbiology and nanotechnology discussion on In Time. That was good. And then I interviewed my friend that's a scientist that just published a new groundbreaking paper about fermentation in algae, about making human proteins in algae, trying to bolster Chlamydomonas as kind of like a protein powerhouse for a lot of materials and high value proteins, which is really cool. And then we did a couple of videos on culturable meat. So that was like fermentation and meat and all that kind of space. And we kind of reviewed that. And then I talked to President Sunday about the climate change solutions, and we went through that stuff. So that was a really interesting conversation. So yeah, check it out.
All right, Amber, you are next.
I am Deanne Amber. I'm sick as fuck, literally, and
negative for COVID though.
Motherfucker, I'm
Negative for
ill,
COVID,
not
though.
sick.
Oh, yeah, dude.
Sick, dude. Yeah, dude. Sick as hell, bro. I stream on Twitch Mondays and Fridays. I usually play video games, but I love talking about science and politics while I do that. Sometimes we just watch YouTube, but I'm pretty cool.
Love it. I love it.
Ouch.
I never know what to say, so I just like kind of ramble until someone's like, yeah, love it. Okay.
Yes, go off, Queen. You got
Next.
this.
All right, Grandma, you know how it do.
Yeah, I mean, you guys know where to find me. Tomorrow, we're going to be taking a look at the climate deal that possibly might be going through. We're also in the latter half of the stream going to be having apparently a debate with half-baked takes. I don't know what we're going to talk about. Last time he was on, he thought that lefties loved Elon Musk, so it should be
dear
interesting.
God.
And putting the
Yeah.
half baked in his name. All right.
Yeah, he was like, I thought lefties loved like electric cars, and I was like, no, dude, we like trains. So
Public transportation, rail, train.
yeah. So that's going to be happening tomorrow, Saturday morning. I'm going to have Arun on to kind of educate everybody on Indian politics and what's going on in Sri Lanka, because it's not getting like any news coverage, and I don't know anything about it. So he's going to be on to teach us a little something. So we've got content lined up for the next couple days.
Good shit. Last but not least, Dr. Neuro.
I'm Dr. Neuro, and I think most of you know what I do already, so I'm not going to go into that. But I do medical education streams on occasion. I'm not as consistent as homozygote, but I do typically stream once in a blue moon. And you can also find me on Instagram and Twitter, which is my primary platform, really, at Neurofoyer. I know they're two different handles. I'm committing a cardinal sin of Twitch. But I always try to go by my original, mantra of academic safe space, in that I encourage anyone who, regardless of education level and regardless of access, to come and ask questions, good faith questions about what they need to do, and how they should approach different, a lot of problem sets that we see in the infectious disease world. And you will not get fluff. You will not get anything from a rose-colored lens. It's the truth and assessment based on that, and also the honest truth about uncertainty in the sciences that we work in. And I hope that, and I know that Homozygote abides by this as very well, which is why we're such good friends, that we operate under the auspices. And but yeah, you can support me in all of those different platforms. And obviously, people, you can DM me if whatever you want. If you are a streamer and you do have further questions, or you want to engage as well, I am open to that as well. Obviously, I'm not here to poach viewers, but I'm just here to get to the truth of the matter and engage people intellectually on these very delicate subjects of infectious and pandemic, preparedness on that. So.
But when are you going to educate people on your lifting routine?
Oh, that's on a Google
get a
Doc.
workout stream.
Oh, is it?
That's on a Google Doc. I could just hand that to you all.
Okay. All right. Never mind.
Hand over these guns.
I actually have a Google Doc on my workout because people kept asking. And I was like, fuck it. Here it is. Just
Okay.
go away.
Oh, sick, man. Nice.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Give that to me and I'll put it in the ministry Discord so everybody
Yes.
has it.
All right. Well, hold on. Let me just pull that up.
Ministry of Gains, more like.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a ministry of bodies built by science.
That's right.
I
That's
can't
how I
remember the last
intimidate.
time I did exercise for the explicit reason of doing exercise, and that kind of makes me sad, but based.
Dr. Neuro, what's your take on PEDs?
Oh, jeez.
On what?
PEDs, performance enhancing drugs.
Oh, Jesus, Mary and Joseph, dude.
It's. Be honest, dude. Be honest.
I'm just-
You just say it. It's okay. You can.
If you want to take it, fine.
Yes.
But why?
Yeah,
Why?
but
Like,
at the discretion of a doctor, how can you say if you're getting your blood work done and if that's I mean, I feel like it's
I think it's fine so long as you're doing it safe, right?
Yeah.
You know?
My
can.
coworker is a frat boy who drinks caffeine-laden
Steroids?
protein stuff before work, and then he'll get to work and drink one of those tiny little coffees that have 1,000 milligrams of caffeine, and he'll just be doing tissue culture, and the whole fucking pipette is just
Shaking.
he can't even get it in a 10 centimeter dish, dude.
why is he taking pre-workout before work? Like,
Because he works out, I guess, but he'll load a gel and just completely ram through 3 walls, and he wants to be a surgeon.
oh
He wants to
jeez.
be a plastic surgeon for
boy.
vein reconstruction and stuff. Veins.
Yes, let me make myself the least qualified for the one job that I want.
We asked him about it. He's like, I can just rest my arm on the patient. I'm like,
Excuse me. Jesus
Okay.
Christ.
I opened up a can of worms. I'm sorry.
No,
Yeah,
you're good. You're good.
I have my thoughts on it, but I mean, long-term effects is now well understood, and it just again, you can do a monitor afterwards, but they get like I guess for me, it's like also as someone who did competitive bodybuilding and also stuff like I don't understand because it's like short-term results for you don't gain much out of it, and I don't know. It's silly to me. So sure you can take it if you have it like if you're doing like proper monitoring and things like that. But it just doesn't make sense to me from the payout perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, dude,
I'm not like in the market or anything. I just when people do like have it like clearly are like dedicated to fitness, I always want to like probe and see like what's your natty no.
You got to be like after kids, and then on top of that, if you go with the exogenous route, I mean your balls are basically becoming as useless as like Christmas ornaments. So
I already took care of that 2 weeks ago. Don't worry about that.
There you go. Well, there you go, Grandma. Now you can look into it. Right?
Yeah.
All right, so by the end of the year, I'm going to expect Gremlo to be like shredded and doing bodybuilding competitions on stream.
We haven't gone in like 3 weeks between like injuries and it's being sick. I miss it.
Maybe that's why you're sick, dude.
I don't blame you.
That's why you're sick.
Why? It's like it's like one of the things that like centers you. When you get into a routine.
There you go.
Oh, okay, never mind.
Dude, I'm actually going under the snip soon too, man. My wife is gonna get pregnant. Get pregnant. She's gonna give birth next week. So then I'm gonna. Yeah, thanks, man. So then that's it for us.
Hell yeah, snip gang.
We're all done with those.
You already have a small clan, Greg. So you're good.
I was going for a hockey team, but we couldn't get there.
Jesus.
I was gonna say you got the hair, so they just have to be alive first.
I tried.
All right, so I guess let me go ahead and call it there. For future episodes of the ministry, I think we're probably going to have some internal discussion about what to do for August 4th. I know on August 11th, we have Reed Van Skank that we had last week. We're going to actually be learning how to do formal academic debate with maybe a little bit of blood sports mixed in. So it's going to be an internal ministry only learning how to debate episode. So we're gonna bring a different kind of debate to Twitch.
Are we going to have a debate?
Because Amber, you weren't there because you were at your family reunion, but our guest, who is a grad student, actually is like a formal academic debate coach. So,
are we going to have any like other guests on, or it's just going to be us?
We'll figure that out. We still have a couple of weeks before it actually happens, but we'll make it spicy.
Invite your actor friend.
Oh yeah, we could rope in Dell. Yeah, I'll talk to Reed and Rap and see what we can swing there. I think later in the month. I think on August 25th we have another academic guest that Professor Hugh lined up. That's Susanna Crockford. And then September 1st we have the chief anti-racist geneticist in Kevin Bird, who literally fights on Twitter against race scientists. So that's going to be a pretty fun one as well, and that might be a double feature depending on if he gets one of his other anti-racist warriors to come on the broadcast. So that's just a preview of the content that we've got in the coming weeks. So that being said, Dr. Neuro... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's wonderful.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know if you were going to say something. Dr. Neuro, dude, again, thank you. I always appreciate it, and always a pleasure to have you on here. Definitely always a fun time to hang out in Dr. Neuro stream. We watched the Vaccine Summit together, so that was a fun event on Neuro stream. So if you're ever, pining for information, Dr. Neuro is certainly a place to go. Mm-hmm. All right, folks, let's go ahead and call it. We just hit the 3-hour mark, so thank you all for being here and for your time. And we'll go ahead and get into the post-panel stream shortly.
Yep.
Peace out, Girl Scouts.
Adios.
Adios, everyone.
There's the button.
All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you, and I will see you soon. Bye.